In an era of darkness, there existed a creator god who formed everything existing on earth. Living beside him was a devil who was indignant about everything God had created. Out of hatred, the devil created a being that cursed all forms of life, and they called him Malum. Then he destroyed everything existing, which fell powerless before such power. Against him appeared a woman, endowed with the strength to face him. She annihilated Malum with God's power and saved the world from total darkness. The people unconditionally worshipped the woman, calling her the saint. Since ancient times, Greece was founded, erected by the king in honor of the saint. Since then, many years passed, and a young woman embodied the power of a god. They called her Violet, a name derived from the designation of a beautiful flower. Right now she was on the balcony, playing with her interlocutor. It was Eselund Ermengarde, with whom she had a complicated relationship. The saint smiled and asked him if she should congratulate him on the victory. She offered him options, but none seemed sincere to him. The girl closed her eyes and nodded, admitting he was right. Eselund pierced her with a cold gaze and asked if she felt anything. She raised her hands when he said that, from today on, she belonged to the temple. The girl played with him, asking if she should thank them for being her family. Despite the warm words, her sarcastic tone betrayed her. She looked away and asked why he was talking about that right now. The man impassively observed the girl's cunning smile. She left him with a mocking smile, ordering him not to worry. The saint finally declared that she had no desire to retreat submissively to the temple. She ended their conversation and returned to the center of the celebration. Violet spoke with the man who took her in and replaced her father. Everyone froze when Cardinal Caesar entered the room. His cunning amber gaze was directed straight at the girl. The priest declared that henceforth she would be obliged to stay away from the world she lived in before. She must leave her castle and go with the cardinal, becoming a member of the temple. He solemnly added that from now on she would glorify God. Caesar smiled cunningly, observing the reaction of the holy maiden. He spoke to her first, demanding to know the approximate date of her journey to the temple. After a brief pause, she declared she was ready to make a bold statement. She shocked everyone by saying she was not worthy to ascend the sacred throne. Her phrase sounded so eccentric that everyone opened their mouths instantly. She declared that at that moment, she was incapable of using the power granted to her by God. Violet said this, looking directly into Cardinal Caesar's eyes. He clearly did not expect her to back down so cunningly. One of the priests accused her of lying to avoid going to the temple. She just said they could verify it themselves if they didn't believe her. The priest hesitated, aware that it would be very problematic. Only Caesar decided to take it as a challenge and stepped forward. Slowly, he extended his hand directly towards the holy maiden. What a surprise for him to find no sacred power in her body. He assumed that she had planned it right from the very beginning. The girl moved her hand away and said there was no reason to celebrate her coming of age. She referred to her humble origin, which had enraged God. The holy maiden apologized sincerely, but her smile said otherwise. For many, the status of a holy maiden implied nobility. However, for the powerful, she was just a chess piece. Everyone longed to take control of her and consolidate their power. She didn't have the strength to fight alone, but she refused to give up. Saint Violet did not want to be just another puppet. Leaving the banquet hall, she cursed this mortal world once more. No one imagined the path she had traveled to get here. She remembered, once again, the dream that had started it all. As a child, she walked through an infinite and immense field. She turned around and saw an impure force, happy to have finally found her. In that voice, unlimited joy mixed with tears. She felt that this entity wished to possess her completely, leaving nothing behind. Violet wanted to flee as far away as possible, but she couldn't. She remained paralyzed, watching the dark claws approach her body. The monster hugged her, as if it wanted to become part of her. She woke up after the monster told her she wouldn't be able to get rid of it. The grumpy old woman goat, who had taken in the orphan, scolded her again. She reproached the girl for her ingratitude and terrified her with suffering. The grandmother only talked about what would have happened to her if it weren't for her kindness. Violet clenched her hands, trembling with fear. Only after she bowed her head did Goat leave. The door slammed shut, foreshadowing a new difficult day. Since childhood, unfortunate Violet has had the same nightmare. In that dream, someone's voice calls her incessantly. At first, it sounds friendly and awakens the desire to be near. But then, time and again, her skin crawls and she runs away. However, tonight that voice finally reached her. She couldn't escape and was completely consumed. Recovering from the nightmare, the girl went downstairs. Beautiful Lena asked her if the old woman had hit her again. The girl replied that it was her fault, after which she was petted on the head. Violet looked at her roommate and asked if she was okay. The girl agreed, thinking again about how someone could hit her. Violet often suffered blows from the old woman. Only the girls felt sorry for her. She barely flinched at the touch. Lena instantly became worried. The girl froze when another female voice called her to work. It was the stern Rose, feared for the old woman's slaps. The girl saw Lena walk away and called her to help. The blonde started begging for a day off, but Rose was inflexible. That place was called Flower Street, a metaphor for a brothel. The girls on that street were given names that meant flowers. Her name, Violet, was given to her following the same criteria. Despite her age, even the owner of the brothel accepted clients. Filth reigned on that street. Morality had no place there. There, every night, beautiful young women like flowers were tormented. Men ripped off their beautiful petals for a few miserable coins. They tormented them ceaselessly, sometimes trampling them until their last breath. Exactly, that future was reserved for little Violet. In the morning, they gathered for breakfast, sharing their concerns. Frisia talked about the priests, who were frequent visitors. She only dreamed of her noble knight. They noticed their sad companion, who apparently got a repulsive client. Although he was a priest, that didn't stop him from committing terrible acts. Finally, the girls screamed, unable to believe that this place was called the Holy Kingdom. Lydia sobbed, not understanding why the saint didn't appear to save them. She dried her tears, asking a bunch of similar questions. Rose only cynically replied that God had abandoned them long ago. She left a glass of wine and added that she doubted God would save people as fallen as them. Violet struck, lowered her head thoughtfully. Just by looking at her, Lydia started to worry about her. Rose looked at the girl and asked what could happen to her. She added that with such a pretty face, it would be easy for her to make a living. The girls agreed and said she had the most beautiful eyes. They showered her with compliments, making the young woman blush intensely. Rose hugged Violet tightly, as if she were her own mother. She looked at her intently, calling her her only chance of survival. The girl asked if she didn't consider them dirty and despicable people. Violet saw them as beautiful, like fragrant and lively flowers. Even if people pointed fingers at them, their souls were pure and kind. To the girl, they were the most beautiful people in the world. She loved spending time with them, seeing them as her older sisters. Unfortunately, their happiness was cut short by the arrival of the old woman goat. The woman was ready to incinerate them with her furious gaze. Panic seized their faces upon realizing what was coming. Rose tried to stop her, but she almost flew towards Violet. The next instant, she slapped the girl. She furiously asked if her words were a joke to her. She completely ignored the pleas that the girl hadn't been drinking. Goat raised her leg, wishing to unleash all her fury on her. She was furious because the young women had stolen her drink. She reminded Rose that she had asked her not to bring them alcohol. Rose pleaded for her to stop, fearing she would beat her to death. Lena clung to the old woman's shoulders, trying to take all the blame. She just kept hitting, not caring that she was only 10 years old. She raised her hand again, after which Rose screamed that she would pay for her alcohol. With hatred, she removed a silver hairpin from her head. The girl threw it at the old woman's feet, just so she would leave the child alone. In response, the woman only measured her with a disdainful look. Her eyes met Rose's hateful gaze. Silently, she bent down and picked up the silver jewel in her hands. Goat arrogantly asked if it was a gift from some client. She left, saying in the end that Violet would go without dinner today. The girl froze, feeling the blood running down her lip. It hurt a lot, but she didn't utter a single word in response. Some girls cleaned the child and discovered her body was burning. She tried to get up to prepare dinner, but her body fell asleep again. In front of her was a girl as white as snow, saying the moment had come. She didn't understand why this girl was telling her to wake up. The girl almost begged her to wake up. Violet didn't understand why her pleas were so sad. She burst into tears, realizing she couldn't help her in any way. Only then did she wake up, hearing Lena's scream. She could barely open her eyes and noticed a girl. She was dressed in a cloak and almost demanded that she wake up. Violet got up as best she could, not understanding what was happening. Rose ran into the room and said the thugs were there. Violet's body was burning, but they had no choice but to flee. The girl's heart beat strongly, as if it were going to explode. Rose grabbed her hand firmly and said there was no time to cry. She didn't understand what was happening until she saw a bright flame. Her entire village was burning to the ground because of the invaders. The houses trembled with the screams of the unfortunate inhabitants. Violet watched families trying to flee, but death reached them. The thugs annihilated the poor inhabitants one by one. She didn't know what to do, but adrenaline injected strength into her body. They advanced, feeling the smoke flooding the entire house. Lydia ran to the emergency exit and opened the door, shouting for them to run. They rushed forward at full speed, before suffocating completely. Rose shouted at Lydia for not leaving and waiting for them. The young woman just winked and said she couldn't abandon them. They ran out of the house, where the beams were already starting to give way. It seemed like all the roofs were burning, with no possibility of salvation. Frisia waited tensely for the others, biting her fingers nervously. Finally, she felt immense relief seeing the girls appear before her. Without any tact, she asked them why the hell they had gone back for the girl. They knew that could cost them their lives, but they couldn't abandon her. The girl remembered Will's words and told them they would be safe behind the mountain. In the forest, following Frisia's lead, they entered the thick forest without hesitation. The girls took off their hoods, enjoying the fresh and pure air. Lydia thought, full of hope, that they could finally be free. Frisia told them that beyond that mountain, there was a city governed by a noble, the king's sword. They continued on their way, enthusiastically discussing their future plans. They were happy to have finally escaped that hell. Violet looked at Rose, who was holding her hand. Her sweet smile sowed hope for a bright future in her heart. After a couple of minutes, Rose stopped, sensing something bad. Her feet stopped immediately, and she pricked up her ears. She extended her hand, ordering total silence and stillness. Her intuition did not fail, and a bright flame appeared before her eyes. They didn't realize that in front of them were death-bearing soldiers. All the girls froze, hearing the sound of footsteps. The next instant, an army of men appeared before them. Violet clutched Rose's cloak fearfully upon seeing the armor. The girl told her to calm down, thinking it was the guard sent to eliminate the bandits. Frisia lit up when she saw her client Will. She ran cheerfully towards him to give him a deadly hug. She hugged him, telling him she planned to look for him upon reaching the city. The girl radiated joy, calling him her knight. That was the only time she saw disgust in his eyes. The girls noticed the terrifying expression on the faces of the knights. Their suspicions were confirmed when the man drew his sword in an instant. He pierced Frisia with a clean and cold movement. A single blow proved fatal for her. The blood confirmed it. Rose opened her mouth. A mixture of shock and fear overwhelmed her. They couldn't believe that the royal guard were those same murderers. The young women kept staring at their sister's lifeless body. Violet, 10 years old, froze in terror for their lives. She remembered how happily Frisia spoke about Will. The girl was laughing a second ago, but now her hopes were shattered. They vanished like a fleeting vision. Only the sword of the knight Will kept shining menacingly. He mentioned Marquis Ermengarde's order to eliminate all bandits. At that moment, they understood they wouldn't leave alive. Rose took Violet by the hand and ran as fast as she could. They plunged into the forest, clinging to the hope of survival. The knights lunged after the fleeing girls instantly. Violet ran, glancing back every few seconds. In the blink of an eye, an iron arrow pierced Lydia. The young woman didn't manage to say anything before saying goodbye to life. She fell to the ground with a thud, startling Violet greatly. The girl screamed her name, feeling tears welling up in her eyes. Lydia's bloodied body lay on the ground, trying to call for help. From now on, another flower was mercilessly destroyed. The remaining girls ran forward, without looking back. They didn't understand why they had to pay for something they didn't do. Their hope was completely crushed upon finding themselves surrounded. Lena froze, protecting the others with her back. Violet's body shuddered with fear, sensing the end. For some reason, the knight stopped upon seeing the color of her eyes. Knight Will shouted at them for stopping. The other knights could not disobey the order and advanced. Rose tried to explain that they had no connection to the bandits. Despite everything, the knights kept approaching mercilessly. They screamed upon seeing that huge mass heading towards them. The girls protected Violet with their bodies, seeking to save her. In an instant, their bodies were completely annihilated. Violet watched them fall lifelessly, collapsing to the ground. She didn't even understand who was the person who hugged her in the end. Her eyes were clouded, preventing her from even distinguishing them. The knight advanced, as if he wanted to save her for dessert. The girl trembled even more, locking her gaze onto his eyes. She was sure she would be next, but something ordered her to wake up. A crack echoed, making us think of her end. She looked at the knight and was astonished not to feel any more pain. In an instant, her bloodied body collapsed onto the ground. Even the knight Will could not hide his astonishment. Violet couldn't understand why they were looking at her like that. Will barely recovered from the shock and got off his horse. He approached the girl and fell to his knees in front of her. Violet believed she would die soon, but something changed. Everyone called her saint in unison and knelt down. The astonished girl didn't even notice that her appearance had changed. The next morning, Agresia Castle was chaos. Representatives of various denominations were perplexed by her arrival. A man asked again exactly where she had appeared. Marquis Bern Ermengarde watched the rest in silence. They were outraged because the Pope's faction could regain its former glory thanks to her. The saint appeared for the first time in 120 years. The men were surprised that she was a dirty commoner. Many of those present thought she was just a legend. They realized that, in that case, Malum was also real. The king of Greece banged the table, demanding silence. He couldn't believe her appearance occurred in his time. His gaze shifted at the idea that even God had abandoned him. Every few decades, the saint and Malum engaged in combat. 120 years ago, after the victory, Saint Anastasia disappeared. She prophesied that evil would not surrender, but God would not yield either. The king supposed the prophecy spoke of recent events. One of the men said that the saint's influence would surpass the Pope's. The Marquis replied that she is now just a small girl. That indicated that her growth could change everything. In the Pope's hands, she will become his obedient puppet. After his response, the man awkwardly apologized for his words. The second man remembered that people from the temple would arrive soon. They had to decide on a plan before that crucial moment. The Marquis directed his gaze to the wise King Trajan. He had been trying for years to wash away the shame of the previous king. The past king was defeated and lost his precious throne. The Marquis wondered if God had really abandoned him. Trajan continued analyzing the situation with great tension. The Marquis confidently stated that he knew a way out for everyone. Meanwhile, the girl witnessed past events again. She remembered her mother begging her to flee, sacrificing herself. The girl saw how, right before her eyes, she was annihilated by bandits. Her father tried to protect his mother, but everything was in vain. They were surrounded by horrible and threatening faces. Violet was paralyzed, with tears in her eyes facing that hell. Her mother's deformed hands reached out to her, asking for help. The girl cried, consumed by her own powerlessness. Her mother kept screaming her name, imploring her salvation. As soon as she raised her head, a sinister figure loomed over her. All this turned out to be a nightmare that tormented her for years. She got out of bed in an instant, without properly analyzing the situation. Violet tried to calm down and understand what the hell was happening. Only then did she manage to recall all the events of the previous night. Her mind clouded when thinking of her sisters, now deceased. She covered her mouth, feeling nausea rising in her throat. Violet closed her eyes tightly, realizing it wasn't a dream. She jumped at the headache and noticed the window frames. They were different from those in her previous refuge, much more humble. The girl was paralyzed, trying to figure out where she was. She squeezed the sheet tightly, as if everything around her was unreal. Violet shuddered upon hearing the voice of the maid who entered. The young woman brought her a glass of water and asked how she felt. Violet concentrated and asked what this place was. The maid replied that it was the residence of Marquis Ermengarde. She immediately assumed it was that high-ranking noble. Her body shook as she tried to remember where she had heard that name. The maid asked her what exactly hurt. The girl jumped when she heard them call her saint. She thought the saint was in that room, not knowing it was herself. She asked the maid in surprise who she was addressing. Her blood froze upon hearing that they were addressing her. She withdrew her small hand, flatly denying what they said. Violet insisted that she was not a saint, that there was a mistake. She trembled, begging for mercy and that they believe her innocence. The maid gently begged her not to speak like that, fearing divine wrath. The girl cried, convinced that everything was a terrible mistake. The maid gently took her hand, asking her to listen. She led her to the mirror, so she could contemplate her own reflection. In an instant, Violet saw a completely different girl. Her hands trembled upon seeing her hair, previously light brown. She didn't understand why even the color of her irises had changed. She extended a trembling hand towards her own reflection. Violet recognized herself, not believing it was really her. The maid pushed back her bangs, revealing the divine stigmata. They were proof that God had chosen her as a saint. All these years, she lived thinking that God had abandoned her soul. She began to rub the mark on her forehead, denying all those words. Violet cried, convinced that the one in the mirror was not her. All that information overwhelmed her, like an avalanche of snow. She fell to the floor, sobbing with fear over what had happened. The second maid ordered that the saint be dressed. Quickly, she added that the king himself had ordered her escorted to the palace. That same day, heated debates shook the palace again. The temple representatives were furious about his unilateral decision. The Marquis replied that the saint lived in territory under his control. He was sure that, because of this, his lineage should assume her upbringing. The man protested, calling it absolute nonsense. Foaming at the mouth, he swore that the Marquis would pay dearly. The king thoughtfully observed the confrontation taking place. He understood that a true battle would now break out over the saint. A few hours earlier, the Marquis had communicated his decision to him. The king banged the table thoughtfully and listened to his proposal. The man proposed, confidently, to make the saint the adopted daughter of his lineage. Everyone was shocked by such a bold decision in favor of the Marquis. The man perceived all the ambiguous reactions around him. Sentobert was the only place that remembered the saint after so many years. In that territory, the power of the pope was even greater than that of the king. The nobility united with the pope's faction donated enormous sums to the temple. This meant that the saint's appearance could only reinforce the pope's power. That's why they had to attract her to their side before it was too late. He added that all previous saints were from noble families and didn't need to learn etiquette. This time, the saint turned out to be a commoner, without any prior education. He insisted that she be raised by an aristocratic family. The Marquis added that they should have insisted she live in his domain. The king agreed that the pope's faction could not object. One of the advisors spoke about how risky this plan was. The king only asked if he was ready to offer an alternative. The man coughed immediately, unable to propose anything. After his words, the king grimly summarized that there was no other option. They could only hope that the saint would accept the hand extended to her. Meanwhile, Violet was just getting out of the carriage. She managed to control her tears and accept the journey. The girl looked ahead in amazement and saw a pompous palace. It was adorned with precious metals and shone brightly. The girl felt some fear before entering. Not long before she was in the carriage, choked with tears. Her maid tried to calm the heartbroken girl. She was consumed by the incomprehension of what had happened. She woke up from a horrible nightmare, and everything had radically changed. Even her eyes, for which she received her name, now shone a celestial blue. She fearfully clutched the edge of her dress, not knowing if she would return alive. Violet suddenly realized that she didn't even have a place to return to. This thought hurt her even more, as if her whole life was doomed. The maid sincerely felt pity for the little girl. She tried to cheer her up, telling her that everything would turn out fine. She petted the girl's head, telling her she was the most important person in the country. The maid tried by all means to calm the girl before the audience. After that, she smiled sweetly and introduced herself as Finn. The girl looked at her and noticed an astonishing resemblance to her mother. It seems that helped to gain at least a little trust in her maid. After some time, she found herself in front of a spacious palace. Finn announced her arrival at the palace and wished her luck. She cautiously observed the interior, not knowing what awaited her. Violet was no longer crying, but she felt an emptiness in her soul. Unfortunately, Finn could not enter the palace with her. She wouldn't be so scared if she were by her side. Despite being a stranger, Finn was the only one who inspired her confidence. Finally, they arrived right in front of enormous doors. The girl froze upon hearing a loud noise behind the door. A guard roughly held her hand and squeezed it. He looked at her with contempt and indicated for her to enter. Violet couldn't resist and prepared for the worst. As soon as she entered, she found herself in the middle of a heated argument. The three factions stopped when the saint's arrival was announced. Violet advanced slowly, feeling the weight of dozens of gazes. She didn't understand why everyone suddenly went silent. The girl took a quick look and saw dozens of stern gazes. She felt uncomfortable because everyone was staring at her. A lot of questions arose in her head about why she was there. She felt she couldn't even lift her head because of the fear. The emperor smiled with contempt upon seeing the little saint. They told her she must kneel before the king. The church representative replied that a saint does not kneel before a king. Because of all the fuss, the girl closed her eyes in fear. She completely fell to the ground, as if she were a slave. Violet thought until the end that all this was a mistake. She feared being beaten worse than by Grandma Goat. The girl didn't know what to do when the king ordered her to lift her head. The man slowly rose from his throne. The girl trembled even more upon seeing him approach. The king ordered her, in a powerful voice, to get up from the floor. Violet immediately got up, as if her life depended on it. She wanted to get up quickly, but nervousness played a trick on her. The girl fell heavily to the floor, enraging those present. They immediately started criticizing her for being a careless commoner. Violet closed her eyes tightly, wishing for this moment to end. The next instant, the saint found herself surrounded by other people. Clergy representatives rushed to help her up. She opened her eyes in surprise, observing the priests around her. Among them, she recognized a very familiar face, that of a priest. She recognized him. It was the same priest who tormented Lydia. He was hitting the innocent girl, unleashing his fury on her. He was terrifying and arrogant before, but now he was begging on his knees. They completely surrounded her. Even High Priest Dublin. The king proposed that the saint make her choice freely. The high priest objected. The church needed the saint. The king turned to the Marquis to make a proposal. He stepped forward and greeted the envoy of the gods. He knelt and added that he was delighted to meet her. His name was Beorn Ermengarde, an influential marquis in the kingdom. His name was the same one she had heard upon waking up. The king firmly declared that she must decide where she would stay. She had to choose between the church and Marquis Beorn's Marquisate. Violet was not prepared for such a burden of responsibility. She was offered the choice between living in the temple or being the adopted daughter of the Marquis. The priest tried to choose for her, saying she should be in the temple. The king immediately silenced him, calling him insolent. He asked how the priest dared to interrupt the king. He addressed Violet again and said that no one would dispute her decision. Living with the Marquis, she could get to know this world little by little. In the temple, she would have been immediately indoctrinated into theocracy and service. The girl felt overwhelmed by the speed with which they demanded she answer something so difficult. In a single day, she discovered she was a saint, and then found herself before the king. She didn't know if her choice would be the right one, and decided to trust her intuition. Finally, the saint pointed her finger at Marquis Beorn Ermengarde. She did not want to be close to people like that despicable subject. The king showed nothing, but was glad everything went as planned. The priest refused until the end, insisting that she was mistaken. The Marquis said that since he had caused her pain, he must pay for his sins. He recalled how the priest asked him how he was going to answer for everything. The Marquis stood up and protected the one who had chosen him. He approached the man threateningly and told him that was his answer. The priest was furious, but could barely reply anything. They continued glaring at each other intensely. The king thought about taking the move, even if it wasn't the best play, but he doubted if they could use the saint for that move. That idea consumed him, considering all the damn risk. The Marquis knew that, from now on, a hard fight awaited them. He noticed that Duke Tigernan had not yet arrived from the Pope's area. He would surely use any method to snatch the saint away from them. In all likelihood, he would not hesitate to use brute force. That's why they had to hurry before he arrived. With that thought, he extended his hand to the girl, inviting her to leave. She distrustfully touched the hand of who was now her guardian. The priest shouted again that he could not take the saint away. The Marquis only replied that the saint had made that decision. He pressed him, asking if he was really going to prevent the saint's will. The man resigned himself and fell, allowing him to leave the hall. The other servants continued shouting her name sadly. Once in the carriage, the girl noticed that Finn was not around. Violet sat restlessly, as if danger were lurking. She disliked feeling the Marquis's piercing gaze on her. She immediately thought she might have done something terribly wrong. Violet closed her eyes tightly and lowered her head, gripped by fear. The Marquis thanked her for the suffering she endured on the journey to the capital. Suddenly, he thoughtfully added that there were no women of her class in his house. This surprised her, as she had seen numerous maids. The man explained that there were no women in his family, apart from the service staff. The girl clenched her fists, not understanding why he was telling her this. She continued to tremble under his cold and accusing gaze. After a brief pause, he promised to ensure she lacked nothing. Violet looked at the man again, unsure if she could trust him. She had never even glimpsed such a wealthy marquis before. She didn't understand if she could even aspire to the saint's position. Violet remembered her origin and wondered when the Marquis's kindness would end. She couldn't do anything about it and resigned herself to her fate. Throughout that time, she silently followed Marquis Beorn. The girl felt a relief upon seeing her beloved maid. She immediately approached the woman, as if she were her only source of trust. The Marquis exchanged a meaningful look with the butler. The man turned to Finn and told her that she would serve the saint. The maid smiled at the girl, affirming that she would help her now. The saint felt relief, as the others terrified her. The moment came when she could finally manage a smile. The Marquis felt joy seeing the smile of his new daughter. Finn asked her if she should introduce her to the young masters. The man replied coldly that the meeting would be tomorrow. Violet was surprised that he was already leaving. The man turned around when the saint was reprimanded for something. That phrase instantly resonated throughout the Night Palace. The girl froze, like an embarrassed kitten. Her heart beat fast at the thought of having done something wrong. She just wanted to say goodbye to the Marquis before sleeping, but they stopped her. It seems her adoptive father grasped her thoughts with just one look. He bent down and told her that in that country she was the most important person, on par with the king. And the Pope. The Marquis added that she must not bow her head. The girl felt it, but still asked if he was her father now. At that tender childish phrase, the Marquis's heart stopped. Violet sadly asked if she couldn't wish her father good night. He felt extremely pleased that she took a step forward. He wished her good night and wanted to stroke her head. He stopped contact upon seeing how frightened she was. The Marquis left in silence, alone with his thoughts. Both Finn and the Saint noticed how thoughtful he became. Marquis Beorn Ermengarde leaned against the wall, meditating. He found it hard to accept that an envoy of a god was his daughter. The next morning, Finn greeted the Saint as usual. She noticed with concern how swollen the girl's eyes were. Finn dedicated herself to comforting the one who had cried all night. It seems Violet succumbed to nocturnal melancholy and sadness. She couldn't fall asleep, clinging to a whirlwind of thoughts. Violet didn't know if she would live a long life or be destroyed too. Due to her constant anxiety, she found new reasons to cry. Finn fixed her hair, talking about her incredible abilities. At first, her body was full of bruises and scars. Now not even a scratch. The maid suggested smilingly that this was the power of a saint. The girl herself seemed to discover for the first time that nothing hurt her anymore. Finn asked her if she was ready to meet the young masters. The saint froze, feeling a new wave of anxiety. Before, all the nobles were arrogant and cruel on Flower Street. That's exactly why she worried about how they would receive her. She understood that she couldn't avoid that destiny, but she was still distressed. Finn hurried her, gently hinting that they might be late. Finally, she left the room, hiding until the last moment behind her skirt. A few minutes later, she saw the very different sons of the Marquis for the first time. The third son, Adrian, shamelessly said that his hair color reminded him of a ghost. The Marquis arrived behind her, ordering everyone to greet her. He looked severely at his mischievous sons. Adrian immediately wanted to reply, upon learning that she was a saint. Only Daniel reprimanded him for his lack of tact and introduced himself to her courteously. He introduced himself smilingly as the second son of Marquis Ermengarde. The saint became flustered upon seeing such a handsome man for the first time. She froze when they told her she had to give him permission to get up. The young woman awkwardly looked away and said she could get up. Adrian immediately ran over to them and asked if she wasn't too stupid. He didn't want to kneel before his younger sister. A single look from the Marquis was enough for him to correct himself. He couldn't believe he actually had to humiliate himself before a commoner. Violet understood that he was right, as that is normally unthinkable. Adrian instantly fell down upon hearing his father's cold tone. The man was furious with his son for his lack of tact. Adrian hurried to hide behind his brother Daniel. The Marquis tried to calm his anger and exhaled tiredly. He addressed Finn and ordered her to take the saint to her seat. Finn immediately took the saint to her place at the table. Adrian was still upset because they would see each other all the time now. He kept glaring at the saint's back. Even sitting at the table, he wanted to make her feel uncomfortable. During all that time, she feared she had done something wrong. Finally, she opened her mouth in astonishment upon seeing the luxury on the table. It was the first time she had seen food that looked so appetizing. The years of famine had deeply marked the little one. The Marquis noticed the absence of his eldest son, Eselund. Upon learning that he had already left the castle, dissatisfaction invaded him. Just at that moment, the girl noticed the empty seat next to her. She was amazed at the number of heirs in that house. As soon as everyone started eating, she became completely paralyzed. The saint felt ashamed because she didn't know how to eat that. It seems Adrian loved the opportunity to offend the girl. He looked at her as if he had discovered her most terrible secret. The boy called her stupid, saying she didn't even know how to eat. He winked and nodded, knowing she had hardly ever seen such food. The boy was surprised to see how much his words had hurt her. Daniel, sitting next to her, cut a piece of meat and told him to stop. He added that Adrian's manners at the table weren't much better, so he should shut up. Meanwhile, Finn handed the girl a knife to use. The Marquis carefully observed this entire learning process. Suddenly, he declared that they should take some etiquette lessons. The saint looked shamefully at the man who had given her shelter. He just closed his eyes and continued cutting his plate. After a brief silence, she agreed to his request to be trained. She was unaware that even a simple meal could be so complicated. The saint closed her eyes, not understanding why she felt that weight in her belly. Finn noticed that the second son, Daniel, was approaching them. He tried to encourage the girl, saying Adrian had always been like that. She looked at him in surprise, not believing he would choose to support her. The boy told her not to worry and to trust that everything could get better. On one hand, he comforted her, but on the other, he pointed out that her manners were horrible. The saint was unsure if she would truly succeed. It seems Daniel realized how much she had changed. The girl fled from them as fast as she could. A crowd of maids ran after the girl and noticed she was vomiting on the floor. Seeing this, Finn felt a mixture of compassion and disgust. She stared fixedly at the saint bent over the floor. Finn approached the girl. She petted her and asked how she felt. Violet didn't know what to do if this happened every time she ate. She didn't understand the cause of this eating disorder. Finn got up and told her she should take a bath to relax. She also found out that she had an appointment with the king today. The saint was embarrassed by so much attention and said she would bathe alone. They explained that it was the maid's job, but she refused. The young woman lowered her head shyly, waiting for them to leave. Meanwhile, Marquis Björn Emmergard was waiting for her downstairs. The butler smiled, saying that the little lady's preparations always take time. Finally, they discovered that the girl was already coming down to them. She walked accompanied by the maid Finn and wore a striking dress. The butler immediately noticed that the mansion seemed to light up. The Marquis joked, asking if it had ever been dark there. He didn't wait for her to finish coming down and ordered her to get moving. Violet was distressed at the thought of meeting the king again. She looked at Finn as if asking if she would bother her again. The maid just smiled and wished her a safe journey. Violet looked at her without saying absolutely anything. She froze, looking at her adoptive father, feeling a spark of hope. She believed and fervently wished that nothing would happen today. A short time later, they arrived at the king's audience hall. They stood still at the entrance, waiting for permission to enter. The Marquis said she must be extremely cautious in the monarch's audience, or when speaking to his family. He also added that she must flee if she saw the priests. The Marquis grimly said that they always look for an opportunity to steal her. That's why she must escape if she finds herself alone. She agreed, because the priests were the ones who beat her sisters. Violet mentally promised herself she wouldn't leave for anything in the world. The Marquis closed his eyes and exhaled thoughtfully. In a couple of minutes, they reached the study of king aggression. The girl could barely utter a word when he asked her name. Her palms trembled upon noticing that even her name was that of a flower. He asked if the Marquis knew it, but received a negative answer. The king was surprised that he didn't even know the name of his adopted daughter. He looked at the girl and saw how much she longed to leave there. They discussed that they should teach her etiquette and then entrust her education to a theologian. Meanwhile, the girl trembled with fear of making a mistake. She was astonished when the Marquis proposed she learn fencing. The king supported him equally, although he seemed somewhat surprised. The Marquis believed she would need physical strength to overthrow Malum. His words plunged the insecure girl into even more confusion. Before she had never studied, but now she was forced to learn several disciplines. The king noticed her mood and suggested she needed a break. Violet immediately raised her head, not wanting to show her tiredness. Despite her attempt to regain control, the Marquis agreed. Violet thought she had ruined it again. A few minutes later, she was next to a beautiful fountain to relax. The girl was impressed by the unique shapes the water created. She looked around carefully, feeling like she was in a place similar to paradise. The girl, amazed, stood still, listening to the sound. She was surprised when a beautiful bird appeared in her hands. The saint immediately smiled at the bird, as if she could hear its thoughts. The servant noticed that she seemed like a different person when she smiled. Violet honestly admitted that the bird made her happy. The man was surprised and asked if she could understand its language. The girl smiled and found it strange that he could understand her. Her interlocutor was pleasantly surprised by these powers of the saint. For the first time, she felt that sacred force floating in the air. He assumed she was the favorite of the god who created all life. The girl found it hard to see herself in that role and doubted herself. They turned upon hearing an insistent priest running towards them. The bird flew out of her hand instantly upon recognizing the scoundrel. He fell to his knees in front of her, calling himself a servant of God. The priest roughly grabbed her arm and pulled her. He insisted again that it was not too late to go to the temple. The priest looked at her like a fanatic, and that terrified her. The man assigned to her shouted at him and asked what he thought he was doing. The scoundrel protested, saying that a mere servant should respect a clergyman. He began to threaten him with God's wrath and punishment for his sins. Violet watched his facial expression intently. It horribly reminded her of the day he beat her sister. The girl bit him with all her might on the hand to free herself. They tried to stop her, but she fled as fast as she could. She feared the priest would try to catch up with her and trap her. After her guardian's words, she thought they might lock her up in the temple and abuse her. Suddenly, she saw a bird in the sky and decided to follow it without hesitation. In the end, the bird disappeared, and she got completely lost in the palace. She had no idea where she was, but knew she had to return somehow. Violet stopped until someone suddenly grabbed her hand. She got scared again upon seeing that they were squeezing her hand and pulling her forcefully. She feared it was someone from the temple again and started screaming in terror. She didn't want to be locked up in the temple and furiously bit the boy's sleeve. He didn't react to the bite. He just told her to calm down at once. The girl stopped instantly, realizing it wasn't the priest's voice. For the first time, she looked up and saw a young man in front of her. To her astonishment, he looked very much like her guardian, the Marquis. His eyes were like the sea, and his clothes were adorned with gold thread. She suddenly remembered how Rose told her about the prince of the castle. The girl realized with surprise that her words were true. She examined him until the moment he raised his hand to her. Suddenly, she realized with dread what she had done. Violet threw herself on the floor and begged the prince for forgiveness. She feared that the Marquis might get into trouble because of her. After her pleas for forgiveness, he asked her if she truly believed he was a prince. She was astonished, not realizing how wrong she was. She backed away fearfully when he extended his hand to her. She thought he would hit her, but he only sat down beside her. She looked into his blue eyes again and felt the warmth of his hands. After that, he pulled her to her feet beside him in one go. She froze upon hearing that they had to leave and that her father was looking for her. He finally introduced himself as the firstborn, Eselund Ermengarde. Violet felt the ground open up beneath her feet from shame. He also added that Prince Charles would only turn 5 this year. Eselund told her to be more careful what she said. He added, threateningly, that if he hadn't found her, her clan would already be on its way to execution. Violet froze, just thinking about the consequences of her mistake. It seemed incredible to her that her clan could suffer because of her. She continued walking silently behind Eselund, squeezing his hand. She was surprised that, although his words were cold, his hands remained warm. Upon returning to the palace, Finn felt that the saint was not well. She asked if the Marquis had scolded her a lot yesterday because of her. The girl was surprised by her question and asked if they should punish her. Yesterday, they only praised her for having escaped the priest. The Marquis was surprised that she returned with Eselund. He didn't understand the reason, but it was clearly visible on his face. Finn suddenly mentioned that, starting today, she would have a tutor. It will be Viscount Iskender's wife, an aristocrat who will instruct her. Finn finally finished her preparations and elegantly braided her hair. She said the Viscountess would arrive after noon and offered her breakfast. Violet was distressed, fearing a repetition of past mistakes. She stopped in front of the hall doors, feeling great reluctance. The girl took a deep breath and with effort joined them. She was surprised to see that Eselund had attended breakfast today. The maid carefully seated her next to the young master. Violet still felt uncomfortable about what had happened yesterday. She froze when they placed dessert in front of her. She was struck by how fluffy and shiny that bread was. She still didn't know how to use cutlery and started biting it with her hands. Before, she always ate hard bread, but this was something incredible. The Marquis watched her intently as she ate with delight. He didn't seem to care at all how she was eating it. Unlike her, Adrian didn't like the taste of the sweet bun. He immediately fell silent upon seeing the Marquis's severe look. Only now did he realize how Violet was eating. He shouted that she should use a knife and called her stupid. He said her face, covered in cream, was disgusting and that he would rather go blind. Violet got scared, not knowing what the first thing she should do was. In an instant, the beautiful atmosphere became oppressive and the food repulsive. Finn noticed her confusion and wiped her stained mouth. Daniel defended her, recalling that her training hadn't started yet. Adrian asked, annoyed, when would her skills improve? He didn't like having to see that at every meal. Violet felt nauseous again from all those insults. She couldn't allow them to see it and tried to leave. The girl accidentally hit a plate with half-eaten bread, which fell onto the table. Violetta panicked even more when the plate shattered. Now she was sure they would punish her and give her a beating. She apologized and started picking up the pieces herself. Everyone tried to stop her, but fear didn't let her hear them. She tried to mend her mistake, but they instantly grabbed her hand. Eselund calmly repeated that they had told her to stop. The girl looked at him as if he were a ghost. The older brother pointed to her cut and said she had hurt herself. Finn ran to the girl and was surprised to see the cut. She suggested returning quickly to the room, while the family remained in shock. Only Eselund looked at her with glacial calm. On the way to the room, Finn asked her how she had broken the plate. She saw that the girl was not well and opened the doors. Violet did not answer. She collapsed on the floor, feeling another wave of nausea. She didn't understand why she always tripped over the same problem. She said she didn't want to eat anymore. Unaware that the Marquis was secretly watching her, Violet said she was always distressed by the possibility of making a mistake. Finn gently hugged the girl and told her that everything would be fine. The girl cried, not understanding why she only showed her worst side. She froze when Finn announced the arrival of the master. The saint froze, realizing he had seen everything. His face was grim, and he himself couldn't utter a word. His gaze met the saint's tense stare. He also noticed the puddle of vomit behind her. The man said she could eat alone if it was overwhelming for her. The saint only nodded her head, guilty, and looked down. After this, the Marquis rushed out of the room. Although she herself wanted it, it hurt her to think they no longer wanted to see her. That same day, the young woman had to attend her first lesson. Adella Iskander politely greeted the envoy of God. Violet instantly realized how incredibly elegant she was. Adella said she had already knelt before her, waiting for a response. The girl was so nervous that she even forgot what she was supposed to say. The woman explained that no one can stand up until she orders it. She asked if up to that moment she had forced the Marquis and others to break protocol. Violet tried to apologize, but Adella called it an act of frivolity. She added that a saint must not turn her humble origins into a weakness. She demanded that she straighten her back and adopt a confident posture. Adella continued criticizing the saint for every superfluous detail. She even reprimanded her for not having healed her own wounds. Violet wanted to reply, but the woman corrected her words. She repeated, asking why she wasn't using her gift of healing. The girl froze when Adella asked if she was seeking attention that way. The woman showed disappointment upon hearing that she didn't know how to heal. Finally, they began the lesson, where Violet felt her insignificance. Adella trained the girl for hours until sunset. Violet tried with all her might to force herself to heal. She doubted being a saint until Finn reminded her of the snack. The maid watched the little one with a smile. The girl attacked the dessert and asked if she could eat with everyone if she learned etiquette. Upon hearing the affirmative answer, she said she still had much to learn. She worried if she would remain herself after learning all that. She entered another world, and now she herself must transform. Before, she was a commoner, but now she is at the top of this hierarchy. Now she only worries if she will remain herself after this path. Finn suddenly said that she shouldn't talk about those things. The saint looked thoughtfully at her maid. She feared the stares of people who didn't change when talking to her. For several days, she lived peacefully, as if she didn't exist. From now on, she ate alone and studied when the Viscountess came. She also went for walks with Finn when she felt suffocated in her room. Recently, the Viscountess started pressuring her even more upon discovering she couldn't read. The girl looked at the butterfly, wondering if she was getting better. Adrian suddenly asked if she wasn't healing her hand on purpose. Violet flinched, not knowing when he had appeared there. Adrian took her hand and asked how much it hurt. He found it strange that glass cuts didn't heal in days. He stood up over her and was surprised to see the girl. He thought she would be different from them because she was from a lower social class. But it wasn't like that. The boy asked her why she wasn't eating with them anymore. He still showed curiosity, but she responded with stony silence. He wanted to leave, as her silence had killed all interest he felt. Adrian froze, like a mischievous cat upon feeling Daniel behind him. Fearing punishment, he instantly hid behind Saint Violet. Daniel let out a tired sigh and greeted the deity's representative. She told him that there was no need to kneel in her presence. Daniel was surprised, but still replied with a sweet smile. He apologized for having to be absent for a brief moment. He approached Adrian and revealed that he had dropped about 100 feet onto his clothes. Daniel asked, in a chilling tone, if he wanted to be the youngest murderer in their lineage. Adrian immediately started making excuses, saying it wasn't what it looked like. Daniel ordered him to go, right now, to do his homework. As soon as he scolded him, his brother shot off toward the palace. Violet was surprised when he said he was really changing. She became sad thinking he didn't like her using the informal "to" with him, but she reassured him. He burst out laughing when she called him Lord. Daniel said that she was his little sister now and asked if she would keep calling him Lord. She was embarrassed when he added that they should call her Lady. He loved her reaction and that's why he added that they shouldn't use those titles. He also proposed calling him brother or simply Daniel. He was amazed by her naturalness in treating someone of such humble birth. He gently stroked his sister's head, making the moment magical. She found it strange to see such a warm and sincere smile on him. She froze when he asked if all this was difficult for her. It was hard for her to answer, until tears sprang from her eyes. Daniel apologized immediately, as he didn't want to make her cry. He stroked her head again, telling her he should have arrived sooner. His tenderness made her cry even more, as if melting her soul. Everything she had accumulated vanished when he asked how she felt. For the first time, she felt accepted and decided to learn more about him. His question made Finn wonder if they had met before. She said she had also met Eselund's older brother. She nodded when Finn asked if he was a good person. Finn said that Daniel was the one who most resembled their late mother. He studies very well and does a lot for the country, surpassing adults. Finn had heard he was weak before she arrived at the palace. She sighed, thinking about who would take care of the little troublemaker if it weren't for Daniel. The saint smiled, thinking about how incredible her brother was. Finn was glad that she was finally interested in the affairs of the house. Actually, Violet had been interested before, but she didn't dare. With these thoughts, the girl began to prepare for sleep. Already in bed, she decided to ask about her older brother's personality. For some reason, his cold attitude inspired a certain fear in her. Finn tucked her in and told her that he was the one who most resembled the Marquis. The Ermengarde family is famous for preparing the army for the royal sword. Violet had already heard about that during the lesson with the Viscountess. Eselund was considered the future heir of the family and had to live up to expectations. This year, he was even accepted into the Royal Knighthood Order. It was amazing that, at the age of 15, he had already achieved so much. Saint Violet was amazed at how persevering he was. His coldness unsettled her, but she remembered the warmth of his hands. She looked out the window, wondering if he was a good man. The next morning, the Marquis arrived at Count Razel's residence. Count Razel reasoned that there cannot be two suns in the sky. The Marquis thoughtfully reviewed that phrase in his head. It could refer to the king and the pope, or perhaps the pope and the saint. The pope, with his high status, and the representative of God cannot be equal. The saint was a being whom neither the pope nor the king could greet. Count Razel added that he still couldn't know the duke's intentions. He asked the Marquis if the pope had tried to contact him in secret. The Marquis replied that he had not. Surprised that the temple did not want to cooperate, the count supported him. The temple should be begging the saint for a deal. Suddenly, he thought the saint would be of no use to his majesty. Duke Tigernan telegraphed that he would come because of the saint's appearance. However, he still hadn't arrived and continued to hide his true intentions. It was unknown whether it was an order from the pope or a personal decision of his. The count understood why the current king hated the temple. He meant that, at this rate, they would follow the same path as the previous king. The Marquis closed his eyes tiredly, knowing his suspicions were true. He felt that, at this pace, history was not going to change at all. For 100 years, without the saint, the temple fell under the gaze of the pope and the duke. Over time, the people distanced themselves from the temple due to corruption, and King Astor seized the opportunity. Then, the pope declared that the king was growing, fascinated by Malum, as evidenced by the natural disasters. Even when a plague ravaged the kingdom, the temple offered no help. Only after hell broke loose did the pope allow priests to help the people. It was said that the duke was to ascend the throne, making his half-brother, Tigernan, king. Accused of demonic possession, he had only one path left. He was completely defeated and overthrown from the throne by the church. In this way, the clergy regained the strongest power. The saint cannot exist far from the temple, which is why the king is so worried. For this precise reason, it was dangerous to let the saint out. Her mere existence is an obstacle to the fulfillment of the faith the king longs for. They were dealing with this matter until the count's daughter arrived. The man immediately began to pamper his beloved daughter. The Marquis couldn't believe that the chancellor of an entire country was so tender. The count turned to Sisu and asked her to greet the Marquis. The girl jumped off the sofa instantly and approached the man. Sisuela immediately bowed and greeted the Marquis. The man greeted her in return and stroked her head. He saw how she reacted to his touch with a smile and remembered Violet. The girl ran to her dad and told him she was hungry. She kissed her father upon hearing that he would make her a crepe cake. They asked the Marquis how the Eye of the Storm was doing at his home. He also asked about the cream buns sent for the saint. His astonishment was immense upon learning that she had vomited. The Marquis sighed tiredly and said her taste was worse than he thought. The count supposed that the saint found it hard to survive in such a place with men. Sisu said she also wanted to see the saint, even if she was a commoner. The girl thought there was nothing wrong with common people. The Marquis calmly observed the tender talk between father and daughter. He decided to ask the girl for advice on gaining the saint's trust. He asked what little girls liked the most. That same day, a pile of striking dresses arrived for Violet. She was delighted that all of that had been bought just for her. She enjoyed that attention and the Marquis's care. She happily agreed to try on the dresses and then received thousands of compliments. Finn was amazed by the beauty of the young noble lady. She said she would bring her tea before the Viscountess arrived. The saint began to look at herself in the mirror, unable to believe it was her. She didn't understand why the Marquis had decided to buy her all those things. Violet turned upon hearing the arrival of the strict teacher. The woman bowed, but her gaze fixed on the striking girl. She asked her directly what she had put on. Upon hearing that the Marquis bought it, Adella tried to guess how much it all cost. She asked if she knew the reason why they had bought it for her. She nodded when the saint said she had to work even harder. The woman added that she had to become a woman worthy of that dress. Adella suggested practicing the way of walking again. Although they hadn't studied it yet, the woman sat down annoyed on the sofa and demanded she hurry up. Violet tried to imitate what the Viscountess expected. The woman bit her lip in disgust and shouted at the girl. She took a whip and said she didn't expect such stupidity. She pierced the saint with her gaze, judging her for how slowly she learned. The girl shuddered when she asked her to lift her skirt. The Viscountess observed every manifestation of pain on the girl's face. Again and again, she dealt painful blows to the girl's shins. The Viscountess suggested practicing table etiquette rules again. In this way, she tortured the saint until sunset. She said she would inform the Marquis that she had been physically punished. Finally, she gave the girl a heavy and contemptuous look. She asked her if that noble dress suited her well. The Viscountess added that she was ashamed of her and demanded that she not show those scars. The saint nodded, but she scolded her even for such a simple gesture. The girl hurried to correct herself and agreed with the teacher. Finally, she was left alone after such a long torture. Her shins were covered in red and bloody marks. The girl concluded that today she had been hit even harder. She repeated to herself that everything was fine, as Old Goat beat her much worse. She decided to go for a walk to recover. Her shins hurt quite a bit, but she wondered if she could meet Daniel. She couldn't say she was being beaten, but he always said she was getting better and better. The saint was lost in her thoughts until she noticed her wayward brother. She wanted to leave quickly, but he immediately noticed the girl's presence. He mocked her again and asked if today she was wearing something that didn't suit her. He stumbled in surprise when she told him she already knew. She darkened and said that she herself knew it didn't flatter her. After this, she clenched her fists in anger and moved away from her brother. He thought she was boring and then noticed an unusual way of walking. The girl quickly sat on a bench, thinking about Daniel. She knew the location of his room, but she was ashamed to go see him. She wanted to go home because of the pain in her legs, but dismissed it. The girl looked up and happened to see a male bird. He was singing praises about how attractive and good he was. He addressed a beauty flying by and asked her to lay an egg for him. Violet sadly watched the mating games of the birds. She didn't understand why her power only worked in strange situations, and she discreetly withdrew. She decided to try visiting the church and see what happened. Violet was surprised that even here there was such a large church. She thought she would just take a look and return to her room. A huge staircase awaited her, causing pain in her shins. At first, fear gripped her because of the strangeness of the place. Suddenly, she found herself right in front of some wooden doors. She froze upon seeing the terrifying gaze of an unknown entity. She believed it was a ghost and, gripped by panic, fell to the floor. What was her surprise to discover it was her older brother. She apologized, incredulous, for having made such an embarrassing mistake again. He just approached the girl and asked how she felt. The girl wanted to get up, but the skirt prevented her from standing up properly. He thought she had hurt her leg, but she flatly denied it. She feared he would think she was a fool for giving in to weakness. Eselund demanded to know the reason why she couldn't get up. Violet felt confusion, not knowing that it was better to answer that question. She did not expect him to lift her skirt himself and observe her leg. The young woman tried to cover her injured legs with shame. She saw his attentive gaze, and she couldn't figure out if he was angry. He coldly said he only wanted to examine her wound. The saint was still stunned by how easily he lifted her hem. It seems she had forgotten that he might discover what was happening to her. The young man darkened upon seeing the mark from the Viscountess's process. He remained still, while the saint continued covering her face with modesty. He barely mentioned the wound, and she remembered what she was hiding. She tried to cover it, but he held her ankle tightly. Eselund asked for what reason she had started apologizing. The girl only replied that she entered where she shouldn't have. She added that she was also apologizing for taking her in and continuing to make mistakes. She looked down, concluding that she was doing it wrong. Eselund looked away while she kept making excuses. She bit her lip in offense upon hearing that dress didn't suit her yet. He told her to tell the maid to save those things for later. He also asked the reason for her walk, after which she said she wanted to see Daniel. Eselund just silently lifted her up to relieve her pain. The girl became distressed and begged him to let her down. She promised to behave and said she couldn't be in his arms. He replied that there was nothing strange about a brother carrying his sister. She knew he was right, but still felt embarrassed. Eselund simply stated coldly to leave everything as it was. With those words, he carried the girl back to the palace. Meanwhile, in the palace, the saint's disappearance had caused a stir. The servants bowed their heads guiltily and announced her arrival. Eselund became furious and ordered the saint's personal maid to be summoned. The girl woke up, surprised that he offered to take her to her room. The saint instantly noticed the tense atmosphere among the servants. A few minutes later, her older brother carried her to the room and laid her down on the sofa. Violet complied with his request, although she worried about breaking protocol. She sat up straight when the butler brought Finn in. It seemed that even from a distance, they could see the bruises on her legs. Finn covered her mouth, terrified upon understanding why she had been called. The saint froze when her brother asked if their father knew about it. She couldn't believe the problem was her injury and not the scolding. Violet didn't understand why. As for her, it was the most normal thing in the world. The butler turned to Eselund, wondering who it could have been. He turned to Finn, but she said she didn't know anything about it. Her voice trembled as she began a plead for forgiveness. Even Adrian ran in, agitated by their noisy argument. He was even more surprised to see the wounds on the girl's legs. His older brother threatened him with punishment if he didn't stop insulting the saint. The boy was immediately frightened and closed his mouth for fear of punishment. It seemed that Finn's reaction further enraged the eldest son. He reprimanded her for not fulfilling her duties and for incompetence. She trembled as he began to think exactly what to accuse her of. Her blood froze at the young man's furious gaze. She understood the danger lurking for her and tried to justify herself. The saint was just as surprised, since he had seemed calm before. However, everyone tensed up instantly when he became enraged. She trembled, thinking this was the first time she had seen someone so terrifying. Eselund added that it was impossible for her not to know anything. He doubted the qualities of the one who had let the whole situation slip by. Violet would not allow him to hurt her maid. She got up and begged him not to punish Finn. Her legs were limping, but she kept begging for mercy. Violet tried to reach him, but he was unreachable. He ordered the butler to pay her triple her salary for all her work. He ended the matter, saying they should pay her severance pay. The girl couldn't believe he decided to fire the innocent Finn. Eselund said he was replacing his father and exercising all his faculties. He added that she couldn't do anything about it. Violetta suddenly realized that he never intended to listen to her. Her soul was tormented by the pitiful sobs of the one who replaced her as mother. Mentally, she apologized to the innocent maid. The girl froze when the maid's gaze turned towards her. The girl looked at her with evident contempt and fury, as if blaming her for everything. That look was familiar to her, and she didn't think she would see it again. It chilled her to the bone and was painfully familiar. Even now, Violet tried to justify her by thinking she was just angry. The butler stepped between the maid and ordered her to follow him. Finn looked at him with a mixture of hope and hatred, as if her future was destroyed. She mentally cursed the saint she envied and served. Meanwhile, Violet frantically thought about how to get her back. She couldn't allow Finn to leave and collapsed on the floor. The next instant, she burst into tears as loudly and noisily as she could. Adrian tried to calm her, but her heartbreaking sobs wouldn't stop. Violet was willing to do anything to justify Finn. Adrian became furious because everyone left, and he had to deal with this. He started distracting the girl and blowing air at her. He promised he would try to talk to her father, just so she wouldn't cry. The saint looked at the boy, realizing he had achieved his goal. The boy added that everything would be fine if he talked to her father. The girl really stopped when he told her to stop crying. Adrian, chivalrously, approached and patted her back. The next day, Viscountess Iskander was summoned to the Marquis's office. She denied her misdeeds, but the Marquis stated that the maid confessed everything. The Viscountess declared that she was only trying to discipline the girl. She added that the saint had been studying for so long that she had no other choice. The woman also mentioned dresses, whose essence the girl does not understand. The Marquis said that she insults the saint with such biting words. She trembled when he threatened that her status would disappear if the Pope or the Duke learned the truth. She understood all the risk, but still believed the saint was just a myth. It hurt her that they ignored her illegitimate daughter due to lack of money for clothes. She was consumed by envy because the saint received different treatment. The Marquis gave her hope, saying he would ask only one question. He declared that he would never forget how she treated his daughter. From now on, your family is banished from my lands. The Viscountess trembled. Her husband must not know anything. She felt her end approaching when the Marquis ordered her departure. She was infuriated that he made a commoner his daughter. Her blood froze when she saw such a terrifying look. She thought he was cold and naive, but he inspired terror. The Viscountess found someone worthy of the royal sword. The woman left, accepting her absolute failure. Alone, the Marquis immediately got to work. He calmly carried out his routine paperwork. He had to choose a new tutor for the saint, but he entrusted it to the Count. Meanwhile, the saint just then opened her eyes. She was surprised to see an unfamiliar maid in front of her. Violet flinched and asked about Finn's whereabouts. The young woman only shook her head silently. That gesture made the saint think that they had indeed fired Finn. The maid saw tears in her eyes and assured her that she would love to be there. She introduced herself as Anne and asked Violet not to be so formal with her. Anne was delighted with the girl's sweetness, but maintained her composure. She suddenly asked the girl if she felt so uncomfortable. The young woman declared that she would like to get closer to the lady. She smiled tenderly and said that now they would try to be friends. Violet listened attentively, but still found it hard to trust. Anne tried by all means to cheer her up and win her trust. The girl was silent for a moment and asked if the Viscountess would come today. Anne almost called the Viscountess an idiot and told her she wouldn't come anymore. Violet was surprised to hear that Countess Reisel herself would instruct her now. The saint immediately thought it would be even worse than the Viscountess. Anne asked her not to worry and assured her that the Countess was very sensitive. The maid begged again to be treated less formally. Anne loved that Violet paid attention to her. She squeezed her hands and told her that everything would be fine. The maid smiled and suggested taking a short walk. Violet was surprised by her energy and accepted the invitation. A short while later, they ran into a scared Adrian. It turned out that Anne was leading a tour of the palace rooms. The maid joked with Adrian about his coarse way of speaking. The saint was surprised by how freely Anne spoke about everything. They continued on their way until they got lost in the kitchen. Anne joyfully introduced the place, where they were preparing a new culinary masterpiece. Jack greeted Anne's energetic maid with a smile. He was stunned to see the saint, which gave him extra motivation. The man quickly ran towards Violet and bowed before her. She tried to tell him that it wasn't necessary, but he was inflexible. She insisted that he stand up, after which he decided to show his respect in another way. He offered her a small cake that he had managed to create. He searched for a long time for something she would like and decided to use figs. Violet had eaten figs before, as they were grown everywhere. She quickly tasted the cake and felt indescribable pleasure. Jack and Anne were happy that she liked everything so much. The man promised to prepare even more sweets for her. Anne suggested eating the rest of the cake in the room after finishing the inspection. The girl agreed, and then they headed to the dining room. As soon as Anne said she would soon eat there with everyone, the saint immediately protested. She said she was a commoner, not a real daughter. The maid became sad and asked if Adrian was bothering her. The girl shook her head and replied that she simply didn't want to see those people's faces. She surprised the young woman by saying she didn't want to see the First Lord either. She understood that it wasn't her responsibility, but she despised those who fired Finn. Violet knew how crucial jobs were for common people. Despite this, the first master cruelly fired the maid. He coldly ignored both Violet's pleas and Finn's words. Anne tried to explain that the master was a good person. Violet wanted to believe it, but with her, he was completely different. Anne unintentionally thought about what she had done to deserve that hair. The saint worried that Anne might get into trouble because of these talks. The maid took the girl's hands and suggested going somewhere else. They continued wandering through the palace, unaware they would run into the Marquis. Anne intentionally wanted to show where the Marquis's office was. She grew up with Eselund since childhood and was a super reliable maid. The Marquis thought the saint would stay, but Anne was handling it great. The man stopped and greeted the saint with impeccable courtesy. The girl froze, feeling a battle of emotions inside her. The next instant, she trembled with rage and ran away. Anne made a quick bow to the Marquis and ran after her. The Marquis sighed tiredly and assumed that the swelling in her foot had gone down by now. Not long before, Adrian was trying to beg for Finn's forgiveness. He recounted how much Violet was sobbing. Like a small child, Adrian begged for the maid, but the Marquis flatly refused. These events made him think that the girl hated him. She didn't know that Finn received money from the Viscountess for her silence. He understood that the saint would hardly believe that, even if they told her. The Marquis looked out the window until he discovered a scene from his past. Before dying, his wife said that he would be less severe if they had had a daughter. He just smiled while holding an umbrella over the woman and watching. All his sons were opposites and demanded severity. He thought that a sweet daughter could have made him a more positive person. His wife, who longed so much for a daughter, died only 5 years ago. It seemed to him that if she were alive, she would love Violet like her own daughter. In that instant, the Marquis felt his total ineptitude as a father. He understood that he would urgently need the help of Countess Razel. Meanwhile, the saint was still desperately fleeing from the maid. Anne chased her, not knowing if she was driven by resentment or blind fury. The girl thought they had fired the kind Finn only because of the beatings. Finally, she got exhausted and tried to catch her breath after the fast run. Anne carefully wiped the sweat from her face and asked how she felt. Despite her affection, Violet still saw her as a simple replacement. However, she was so kind that it was absolutely impossible to be angry with her. The maid calmly asked her the reason why she had acted that way. The girl couldn't admit that she hated the Marquis. She looked up upon hearing a familiar voice in the distance. In front of her was Daniel, worried, who seemed like an angel among the others. The distressed girl, without saying a word, took refuge in his arms. She clung tightly to the boy, feeling the warmth of his sensitive touch. He turned to Anne and told her that he himself would take her to her room. Daniel apologized to the saint for not knowing about the beatings. The girl said that everything was fine since she hadn't told him. The boy, worried, asked if she could even walk. He was the only one capable of understanding her feelings towards the maid. She thought he could influence the Marquis and help. However, Daniel just shook his head, feeling guilty. He knew that his father and brother were the type who would never retract. Even Ed, at only 15 years old, was a cold and imperturbable man. He stroked her head and told her that she could vent by crying. As soon as he said he was on her side, tears sprang from her eyes. It seemed to her that his entire figure radiated a bright light. That same night, she got ready to start her lessons. As soon as the Countess was surprised, she started worrying about her curtsy. The Countess was only distressed about having nothing to teach her. With a sweet smile, she greeted the saint and proposed to begin. Violet just shyly looked away and nodded. In her mind, she hoped that at least today they wouldn't hit her. They were studying a new element, at which point she made a mistake. The Countess delicately touched the girl's chin. She gently corrected the girl's posture and indicated how to hold her chin better. Every instruction was soft and clear, which allowed the girl to immediately understand what to do. Violet was surprised by how the Countess praised her after every achievement. She supported the saint, commenting on how well she was doing. The Countess suggested having lunch and then continuing with the study of table protocol. With just that phrase, a shiver ran down the saint's body. Countess Razel decided to learn the basics directly through practice. She knew the saint's problems and truly felt empathy for her. She asked the girl not to worry and told her she would help her. Mealtime was Violet's weakest point and caused her much anxiety. She froze upon hearing the Countess's first instruction. She apologized, but the woman reacted to her mistake with a smile. The saint paid attention to every indication from her new teacher. She began to worry when she felt she was pressing the knife harder than necessary. In the end, the girl accidentally dropped the knife on the floor. Countess Razel was astonished when the saint stood up and bowed her head. She said she was ready to accept punishment for her mistake. The Countess was shocked that the saint expected to be hit. She asked if the Viscountess had really raised her that way. The saint closed her eyes in fear, thinking they would hit her at any moment. To her surprise, Countess Razel only tenderly hugged the poor girl. The woman asked her to calm down and told her she would not hit her. She promised there would never be violence between the two of them. Her sincere and compassionate look gave her the certainty that they would not hit her. The Countess smiled and told her to sit at the table immediately. The saint tried again and this time she succeeded. Thanks to her method, the girl was able to adapt and gain confidence. With the woman's tender care, her skills began to grow. With that support, she felt that everything, little by little, was improving. After this, 2 whole seasons passed, and winter arrived. The countess noticed that it might start snowing soon. The girl couldn't believe so much time had passed since she arrived. The countess realized that something had caught the saint's attention. Violet confessed that her birthday would be in a week. At that simple phrase, their faces darkened instantly. A couple of days passed, and the atmosphere in the house changed even more. Since that day, servants were running from one side of the mansion to the other. She was surprised how nervous everyone around her seemed. She didn't even understand why Anne had told her to wear that dress. On her birthday, she felt that dress wasn't for her. Violet froze when Anne led her to some enormous doors. Finally, the maid congratulated her with a smile on her 11th birthday. It was the first time they had prepared so much for her birthday. As soon as the doors opened, she discovered a shining hall. The girl couldn't believe all that had been done for her. Anne said everyone gathered to celebrate her birthday. Originally, the saint's birthday was celebrated throughout the state, starting at age 16. However, the Marquis still decided to organize a worthy party. Violet still mistrusted the man. She thought that, in return, he would review everything she had learned during this time. Even Jack prepared a huge strawberry cake for her. All the ladies present congratulated the saint with a smile. They surrounded her, telling her how much they wanted to meet her. The girl thanked them, not believing they had really come to see her. Violet turned upon hearing the familiar voices of the boys. Before her appeared the Marquis's 2 sons, dazzling everyone with their beauty. Daniel smiled sweetly and congratulated her on her birthday. He flattered her, telling her that dress did justice to her name. Daniel added that she now mastered etiquette and had become a true lady. Violet felt immense relief upon confirming that she had made no mistakes. Adrian, as always, grumbled and said he hadn't been able to practice fencing. He asked why the hell he had to celebrate someone else's birthday. What was his surprise when he was ordered to go to his fencing lessons? He asked back, astonished, which made Anne laugh. The girl added that she shouldn't be forced to stay to celebrate her party. Shame overwhelmed him, and he ran towards the exit of the hall. Violet froze when the adults approached them. The Marquis walked escorted by the Razel couple. The teacher introduced her amiable husband to her. The Marquis joined in congratulating the young saint. Violet still didn't understand why he had orchestrated all this. She also saw Count Razel, ecstatic, staring intently at her. To her surprise, the Marquis quickly covered her with his back. The Count demanded he move aside, saying he wanted to see her. Despite his pleas, the Marquis stood firm. The man insisted on calling the saint out so she could be seen. Violet looked at the Marquis in surprise when he refused. The Count wanted to bring his daughter, but did not succeed. The saint didn't understand why the man was smiling so slyly. The Count raised his hand solemnly and said it was time for gifts. At first, he wanted to hand it over through a servant, but decided to give it in person. The girl was delighted with such a big gift. She immediately thanked the Count for the gift, whose contents she did not know. Daniel encouraged her and told her that he was also very curious. As soon as she opened the box, a bear appeared in her hands. She felt childish joy seeing such a big and soft plush toy. Before, she couldn't even touch toys, as her family was poor. She remembered that toy they denied her and saw that this bear was even bigger. All those present were astonished to see the colorful decorations bloom. The Countess was able to see live how the flowers opened. She suddenly realized that it was the saint using her power. It seems that not even Violet understood how she had managed it. They immediately began to praise her for what she had done. Violet looked up, as if she didn't believe she had made those flowers bloom. It seemed to her that even the flowers were congratulating her on her birthday. She accepted when Anne suggested taking the toy to the room. Daniel moved aside upon spotting an old acquaintance of his. The girl was left alone with the unpleasant Marquis. She requested permission to go outside. She quickly thanked him and fled upon getting consent. Violet left just because she felt uncomfortable and didn't know where to go. She wanted to return to the room, but accidentally overheard a conversation. Those same women were criticizing her in the worst possible way. They even reproached them for pompously celebrating a commoner's birthday. They added that everyone had come for their children, not for the saint. Their hurtful comments rained down on the girl like an avalanche. She ran forward, not understanding the reason for such hypocrisy. It seemed unfair to her that they hated her just for her origin. She cried, indignant at having to hear that on her birthday. Violet never wanted to be in that place, nor did she choose her destiny. Flowers sprang from her tears, but she didn't want to see anyone. Finally, she ran out into the street and sat on the ground. Unlike the palace, on the street of flowers, nobody said she looked silly. Her silence was interrupted by a young man, surprised to see her there. He calmly demanded that she get up from the ground. He saw that she wasn't responding and gave her a little touch on the hand. Violet saw for the first time someone so beautiful, like an angel. She thought he was a woman, but he replied that he was a man. Violet immediately felt uncomfortable, but he just laughed. The stranger asked her the reason why she was crying. The girl didn't want to tell him the real reason for her tears. She feared he might also start laughing at her origin. He said he came specifically to look for her, but it saddens him to see her cry. He added that it saddens him even more when she doesn't tell him the reason. Violet didn't understand why he was going to cry, as if it had happened to him. She looked away, although she ended up confessing the reason for her sadness. The girl recounted how they made fun of her for being foolish and poor. The young man suddenly hugged her and supposed she had a hard time. She burst into tears when he asked her if it was hard to live like that. He said that the world is full of happiness, but she was not lucky. The girl rejected his words and said that the world is full of misfortunes. She mentioned all her sisters, who had had very bad luck. Violet observed her companion closely again. She still couldn't believe a man could be so handsome. She was embarrassed to realize that he noticed her inquisitive gaze. He turned and asked if she had missed him too. The young man said he missed her very much too, as if he knew a secret. He stopped halfway and added that he had waited for her a long time. Violet froze, not understanding why she hadn't noticed him until now. For the first time, she noticed his clothes, which resembled a spiritual habit. He looked at her and said he had come to find her. He added that he didn't care about her origin and that he wouldn't hurt her. Finally, he extended his hand to her and suggested they go with him. It seems he managed to win her trust and impress her positively. She was about to leave, but the Marquis's eldest son got ahead of her. Violet froze in shock upon seeing the blade appear next to her. Eselund's sword was pointed directly at the strange boy. He coldly demanded that he identify himself immediately. The strange young man just smiled, staring him in the eyes. It seemed he wouldn't lower his sword until he got an answer. Violet collapsed on the ground, feeling terror leave her powerless. The young man said he was a simple priest passing by. Ed reprimanded him for trying to joke, as it sounded like mockery. The young man said he was waiting for the arrival of King Tigernan, son of Ermengarde. The saint froze, trying to remember who he was talking about. His older brother declared that he hadn't invited him. The young man smiled mockingly and asked what he should do now that he had arrived. He menacingly added that he couldn't touch him and avoid the consequences. Violet was shocked by how quickly he had changed. Eselund lowered his sword and said that the saint belonged to his lineage. Nevertheless, the clergyman continued to insist on his stance. He said he doubted that everyone else thought like them. He smiled again and approached the girl who was sitting on the ground. The young man gently squeezed her hand and said that now they had consequences. He lifted her up and told her that next time she should take his hand. Finally, the stranger gently brushed his lips against her palm. He left in the opposite direction, without saying absolutely anything. As soon as they were alone, Ed asked her if her father had warned her. Violet turned, aware that he could get very angry. It was obvious that if she took the young man's hand, the Marquis would take it as a loss. Memories of her sisters' deaths returned to her mind. Ed called her, telling her that if she wanted to stay there, he was at her disposal. Violet didn't want to return, fearing the judgment of others. She stepped aside, determined not to return to such a house. The girl looked down, wondering if there was anyone sincere at his party. Ed covered her and asked if she wished for all the garden flowers to bloom. She was surprised to see an unusually blooming garden in front of her. The young woman couldn't believe her power had been involuntarily unleashed again. Violet opened her mouth, astonished by all that beauty. Ed told her that she was not wasting her kindness in vain. The young woman stared at her stubborn brother. She involuntarily wondered if he suspected that even a casual word from her hurt him. She got angry again because of all his words and took off his coat. He wanted to tell her she might catch a cold, but she was inflexible. Ed unexpectedly asked her if she regretted not following the priest. Suddenly, she shouted and said she really regretted it for that. It seemed she had put all her accumulated anger and resentment into those words. Now she thought she really should have followed him. She didn't suspect his true intentions and considered him a saint. Now she was surprised that her older brother was following her directly. She was forced to stop when his hand grabbed her by the waist. Violet screamed, demanding he let her go, but he was inflexible. He continued looking at the flowers, as if nothing had happened. A brilliant flower garden appeared before them. He kept holding the girl and said the gardener would have a hard time. Violetta declared with disgust that she hated him more than anyone. She added that she hated his courtesy, but that enraged him. He pulled her towards him and told her he wouldn't let her escape to the temple. Ed said he was tired of her childishness and she must respect her father. Apparently, those words made her reflect on her behavior. Mentally, she called herself foolish for having seen a prince in him. Violetta felt ashamed that he treated people like a nuisance. She was more embarrassed that he kept moving forward with her. After a while, they finally returned to the palace. Anne was happy to see the offended girl in bed. She tried to find out why her eyes were red, but the saint refused to go to the party. Anne immediately started talking about how hard the Marquis tried to organize it. Violet hid under the blanket and said she had never asked him to do it. Despite her touchiness, she wondered if Anne would be punished. She didn't want them to hurt her and got out from under the blanket. She annoyedly asked the maid why she was laughing. Violet admitted she was angry with Ed, who grabbed her like a sack of potatoes. Anne laughed so much that her stomach unintentionally hurt. She replied that the master had rushed a lot to organize such a party. The maid recalled all the preparations they managed to make. It seems her words managed to influence the offended saint a little. Anne suggested faking an illness to have an excuse to be absent. She added that otherwise, they could punish her severely. Finally, Violet fell asleep, hoping the Marquis would find her sick. With just one look at the girl, he knew she was faking. Anne confessed that she was the one who had asked her to do that. The maid recounted that the saint had argued with her brother and came back crying. At first she thought of Adrian, but it was Lord Ed. The Marquis was surprised to learn that Eselund had argued with a girl. Anne tried hard to recreate the circumstances of their conversation. The man thought better of it upon seeing Ed carrying the saint. He couldn't figure out why that had ruined his mood so much. The maid immediately began to suppose that he had angered her. The Marquis nodded and said that Ed had made a big mistake. He sat down and looked again at the girl who was sleeping. The man sat quietly nearby to watch his daughter. He found it amusing that she was sleeping after making a garden bloom. Now he undoubtedly understood that this girl was truly a saint. It seemed incredible to him to see flowers blooming in the middle of winter. Everyone present was fascinated by this true miracle. Apart from that, there were guests who did not receive an invitation. A man who is the Pope's right-hand man showed up. Anne curtsied and said that the saint was unwell and could not come. He assumed it was an excuse, but he could not object. The Marquis was glad that Anne appeared at the right moment. They could not allow the Duke to see Violet for a second. Before, he thought it was mean to pretend to be sick, but now he had a different opinion. He snapped out of it when Anne's maid addressed him. She handed him a little bear, after which he told her to place it nearby. The next morning, the saint discovered that the bear had changed. She didn't understand why the green ribbon had turned purple. Anne noticed the girl's confusion and told her she needed to wash up quickly. Not even an hour had passed when the girl was completely dressed. Anne smiled seeing that the girl didn't let go of her toy for even a second. The girl was about to reply, but the Marquis who entered interrupted them. He pretended to believe her lie and asked how she felt. She nodded and then heard that her immense power had even surprised Duke Tigernan. The saint didn't understand the reason why he had come to the celebration. She also didn't know if she should tell him about that priest boy. After thinking it over, she shook her head thoughtfully. The Marquis, unintentionally, noticed the difference in the toy. He decided to change the subject and asked if she liked that toy. He made her happy by telling her she could take it with her as much as she wanted. The Marquis felt relief upon seeing her smile. He thought she hated him. The girl smiled sincerely and thanked him for the permission. The man smiled sweetly, wanting to capture that moment in his mind. That same day, the girl was supposed to have a lesson with Countess Razel. The woman said she had worried a lot upon hearing she fainted. It was no wonder she was tired after fixing the entire garden. Even the aristocrats, indignant about the ball cancellation, were dumbfounded. Besides that, the Marquis handed out some flowers, and the guests left happy. The Countess added that, in winter, flowers are an indescribable luxury. She gave her some lilies and said they were proof of a god's love. The girl thoughtfully squeezed the flower in her hands, thinking about God's love. Suddenly she thought that, if he existed, he would resemble that young man. She couldn't believe Ed had dared to point a sword at such a person. The girl still didn't understand the motives of her strange brother. She clenched her fists and decided that today she would study with Ahinko. In this way, the classes finally began. The countess decided to read her a book about how immense a saint's power is. She asked if she knew the stories about the first coming of Malum and the saint. She was called Aggression, and an entire kingdom was named after her victory. Violet remembered that legend being read to her often as a child. The countess asked if she had heard of the previous saint, Anastasia. The woman smiled and suggested starting with that story. It was said that she was the most beautiful and closest to God. About 120 years ago, she suddenly disappeared, which is why they called her the Saint of Legend. She was born into the house of the Marquis of Grapes and awakened her power at the age of 8. Anastasia possessed the most formidable power and defeated Malum in record time. Besides that, she also repelled the attack of the Gunnar heretics. Violet took a deep breath and asked if she would also have to defeat Malum. The countess nodded, smiling, but the girl could hardly imagine it. The countess pointed out the prohibition established by the first king. No one had the right to interfere in the sacred battle between the saint and Malum. The girl was puzzled that all saints grew up in luxury from a young age. Unlike them, she only managed to learn to read, write, and some etiquette. Even her name sounded strange and unworthy of such a responsibility. She asked the countess the reason behind the existence of that prohibition. The woman supposed he simply wanted to avoid more sacrifices. The girl felt a wave of panic and wondered when Malum would arrive. According to records, he always appeared after the saint's maturity. Violet asked to be shown a portrait of Saint Anastasia. The countess replied sadly that not even one remained in the temple. It was an order from King Demetrius, number 167. He was considered the grandfather of the current King Trajan, but she will know that later. The countess told them not to mention that in front of others. She looked thoughtfully out the window and remembered King Demetrius. For Violet, it was a real surprise that he loved the saint. She walked through the garden, contemplating the divine and fragrant flowers. The king's love for Saint Anastasia became a famous legend. He was crazy about her, as if she were a messenger from God. In the end, out of rage, he destroyed all her portraits and statues. To everyone's surprise, he lived over 100 years and died saying her name. The remaining portraits and statues were destroyed by order of his son Astor. The girl became sad about the symbiosis of the father, in love with the saint, and the son who hated her. She looked at the roses, unable to believe she had done all that. Violet froze in the middle of an immense and impressive garden. She bent down, feeling how the scent of the flowers seemed to sing. She was so absorbed in this that she didn't notice someone else's presence. The Duke approached and asked her not to make so many flowers bloom next time. The girl was astonished, trying to understand when he approached. She instantly examined the stranger and felt a threat. She didn't know whether to flee from him or stay by his side. Violet froze, asking him who he really was. The man only smiled silently, observing the saint. She hesitated to answer, as she didn't even know what to tell him. He smiled and humbly introduced himself as a traveling priest. The Duke tried to impress, but Violet suspected. She doubted he could show up unintentionally 2 days in a row. The man approached, saying he loved yesterday's miracle. She flinched when he asked if she was tired. The Duke eagerly noticed that the saint was afraid of him. She only asked if he had received permission from the Marquis. She remembered Daniel, but the Duke replied that the second son was already aware of his arrival. Initially, he didn't even expect to meet the saint. He supposed everyone thought she had already returned. Violet thought he was different from the priest she had seen before. She accidentally noticed that the white flower was withering in her hands. The girl couldn't understand why he seemed so familiar to her. She decided to find out and dared to ask his full name. The man darkened, just like the sky, and introduced himself as Caesar. Violet froze upon seeing the unusual color of his eyes. She immediately remembered yesterday's priest with golden eyes. Besides him, her king also possessed the same type of eyes. The girl became distressed and asked if he had come to take her away. He only smiled and replied that he would do whatever she wished. He stood still, and an unknown force consumed the flower in her hand. Violet was surprised at how brightly and beautifully it shone. The man smiled and said that she possessed nobler abilities. He added that she could use the power, but should not revive plants. Caesar argued this with the laws of nature. Plants must sleep in winter and then wake up in spring. The saint woke up the sleeping plants, and they must go back to sleep. He touched the flowers, calling death a very painful process. Caesar did not threaten, but Violet felt a strange emptiness. She turned around and saw how much the previously clear weather had changed. For the first time, she thought about the big mistake she had made. Before, flowers made her happy, but now she understood they were dead. Tears appeared in her eyes for the transgression she committed. She looked at the flower, saying she didn't want this to happen. Violet confessed, through tears, what had happened. The man was irritated to learn that she had been crying yesterday. Caesar grimly asked her who had made her cry. She didn't want to give names, but he insisted ceaselessly. She admitted to overhearing the ladies' conversation yesterday. The girl added that nobody would want to visit a commoner here. He wiped away her tears and swore that no one would insult her like that. Caesar said they were liars, unaware of the world's truth. Violet stood still, feeling the soft and dense perfume. In his protective embrace, she found unexpected solace. He smiled, calling each of her tears valuable. Caesar stroked her hair and added that even a drop of her blood is a divine miracle. He turned and suggested she look at the flowers. The girl panicked, realizing her tears had revived the flower again. Caesar only said calmly that there was nothing wrong with that. He added that this was precisely why he was there. He snapped his fingers, and a sacred force was released into the air. Instantly, it spread throughout the garden, snatching the life from the flowers. He smiled amidst the dead garden and said he had returned everything to the laws of nature. Caesar added that from now on it wouldn't hurt, but she felt afraid. He explained that the flower was only sleeping, and they would see it in winter. Violet looked down and asked if she had done much harm. He explained that the flowers woke up because they missed her. Caesar declared that they went to sleep happily, knowing they had a saint. He added that they longed for the moment to meet her again. Getting no answer, the man told her to return to the palace. She was surprised when she turned around and asked if she would see him again. That question pleased him, and he replied yes, that he would see her. Caesar rested his forehead against hers and promised to visit her again. After this, the girl, thoughtfully, returned to her home. She was still pondering everything that had happened to her lately. Anne ran to her instantly, as if she had disappeared for days. Violet reminded her that she had said she would go to the garden. Anne admitted she forgot, but was glad for her return. She looked ahead and saw something that left her completely shocked. It seems the other servants also noticed that. The butler narrowed his eyes, trying to understand the change. Everyone froze upon seeing the sinister garden. A short while ago the flowers were blooming, but now they are completely dry. They concluded that only the Duke could have influenced it. That same rainy night, the Duke hurried back home. Daniel tried to tell him that everything was fine, but he didn't believe it. He only calmed down upon seeing Violet sitting on the sofa. At that moment, he felt all the anguish dissipate from his heart. Their surprised gazes met without a single word being spoken. Daniel ran to the girl, as if she were merely an illusion. He showed his father that the saint was completely safe. The man just sighed wearily and nodded to his son. The girl didn't understand the reason for the Marquis's visit. The Marquis asked if she had encountered any stranger that day. The girl decided to lie, knowing someone could suffer because of it. She said she did nothing with the flowers and doesn't know why they withered. The man smelled the lie of his stepdaughter, but he didn't want to pressure her. Daniel smiled and asked her if a strange man hadn't approached her. He was surprised when he was ordered not to talk nonsense. The firstborn said that the saint is still too young to understand many things. Daniel disagreed and believed that Violet understood everything. Ed darkened and asked if it didn't matter that the saint knew the Duke. The girl froze when they talked about Duke Tigernan again. She thought of the redhead, but he introduced himself as a priest. He also demonstrated his power. Sowing doubts about whether he was even a priest, Ed enraged Daniel, calling him a coward instead of courteous. His argument was that his father would never have let the Duke in. The saint didn't understand why Eselund only talked to Daniel. She dropped the bear and stood up, understanding she must protect him. She shouted at the first prince, demanding he stop bothering them. She surprised the men by adding that he had done everything possible. Violet didn't want to cry, but those two men terrified her. She was terrified by the idea that they would now take him away from her and Daniel. The Marquis approached, saying she had misunderstood something. The girl became petrified, looking fearfully into her severe father's eyes. Eselund's stubborn gaze intimidated her even more. He moved away from the girl with contempt, without saying a word to her. The Marquis told Daniel, as a final thing, to calm the saint properly. After that, he left them alone, knowing that Violet only trusted her son, as if it were a sign from heaven. The rain hit the window again. Daniel asked why he had told them that, if she feared them so much. He darkened when she explained that she only wanted to protect him. She said she wasn't doing it out of kindness, but because she trusted him. The boy smiled ironically, asking her again about that. The girl turned and said that he was her precious older brother. Something in her heart trembled when she added that she only had him. A smile reappeared on his face, and he said that he only had her too. At first she was surprised, but the boy's answer cheered her up. The next instant, he knelt down and hugged his little sister. The girl thought that he might also feel lonely, being the only blonde. It seemed to her that he might also need affection and support. A couple of minutes later, she declared that she was suffocating from the hug. He looked down and begged her to stay like that a little longer. Violet was willing to endure it, if that made him feel better. After that day, the Marquis was absent for several more days. The girl kept attending classes, giving absolutely her all. She diligently read her books and completed her assignments. Violet didn't know the letters well, but Daniel helped her study. Approximately 10 days later, the Marquis returned to the estate. He gave the girl a new doll, incredibly realistic. She was surprised to hear him say he bought it for her. Violet felt confusion, but still thanked her father for the gift. She froze when he asked if she felt better, hinting at her illness. The girl felt a sharp remorse and said she was already feeling better. The Marquis also confessed that Etta was scolded for that incident. The man was sure that he had behaved disrespectfully. He looked away and promised his daughter that it would not happen again. The saint was glad that he had done such work. The man wanted to stroke her head, but she got scared again. It seemed to her that he would hit her, but he stopped his hand immediately. The girl looked with surprise at the man sitting opposite her. She saw sadness on his face when he told her to stay on the estate. It was a real shock for the saint, as she would be away from her family. That same night, her brothers went out to accompany her. Daniel, with a smile, asked her to write to him upon arrival. He begged her not to worry and assured her that good people lived there. Adrian told her that he didn't need her letters because she wrote terribly. He added that if she sent him a letter, he would gladly instruct her. Daniel retorted that his grammar wasn't perfect either, and Violet might not understand his handwriting. The boy instantly got furious, but Anne appeared just in time. She decided to take the girl away before the conversation continued to escalate. Violet noticed Ed, who hadn't uttered a single word. She didn't understand why he was looking at her so intensely. Finally, she was distracted upon hearing that it was time to leave. The girl walked sadly towards the carriage, wondering if she would ever see that place again. She observed the mansion, not suspecting if they would allow her to return. Violet stopped, unsure if she should take her brother's hand. Ed, as always, remained silent, without uttering a single word. Finally, she took his hand and walked up the steps. To conclude, he said she would have some time to be alone with herself. Violet reflected with surprise on his strange phrase. She didn't answer her brother and left, immersed in great confusion. The girl didn't know how long she would have to spend in solitude. It was the first time she had left the mansion since she moved to the palace. The saint began to think that the Marquis no longer wanted to protect her. Anne guessed her thoughts and asked if she was sad. She explained that the Marquis worried about her, so she should hide. At first, she didn't understand exactly what the maid meant. She thoughtfully replied that she would understand when she was older. Finally, Anne let slip that she would be there for 2 months at most. The maid cheerfully pointed out that the first snow had fallen. Violet followed her example and attentively watched the winter miracle. They were surprised that it had started so fast and so soon. The estate was in the northern area, where it was much colder. Finally, they reached the mansion as night fell. They were dumbfounded by the immensity of the place. Violet wondered what they would do during all that time. Anne didn't know, but suggested continuing to learn etiquette. The girl was excited by the proposal to explore the mansion. She decided that afterwards she would read a book and write to Daniel. Anne felt relief, knowing that the saint was welcome there. She also thought it would be good to practice her spiritual power. Violet felt bewildered, as she didn't do those kinds of things. Anne insisted on the need to master that skill. She kept talking, but the saint became engrossed and heard nothing. Even before sleeping, she was worried about how to control the power. She understood that, in time, she would have to justify her status as a saint. Violet was distressed about not being able to fulfill the other obligations. After a few minutes, she finally fell asleep. She was surprised to see an infinite sky and grass before her. She looked up and saw a familiar girl. The stranger looked like a more mature version of Violet. She greeted the girl with a sweet smile and closed her eyes. The stranger said that Violet had grown strong enough to see her. The girl didn't answer anything and was surprised to feel tears on her cheek. For some reason she felt sad, as if her heart were in a vice. The young woman touched her cheek and asked why she wiped her tears so quickly. Violet mentioned the priest's words about the resurrected plants. The former saint smiled and asked what happened after that. The girl said that he made all the flowers wither again. The saint froze and her face no longer radiated a wise smile. Violet sadly clutched her dress and called herself useless. She still thought that God had chosen her by mistake. The saint said that she was undoubtedly her daughter, and it saddened her to hear that. She demanded that she extend her hands if she doubted her power. The girl fulfilled her demand and then closed her eyes. The young woman asked her to concentrate on her power. At first, Violet didn't understand what to do until she saw a brilliant ray. She realized she had already felt that source from which she drew energy. The girl understood that they were the same as that day in the garden. She felt euphoria when the saint told her to open her eyes. Violet could hardly believe she possessed such incredible power. She watched the young woman, who seemed to transmit her own strength to her. Their concentration together caused the growth of a beautiful tree. The ex-saint smiled and recalled the girl's phrase about feeling sorry for the flowers. She called that priest kind, but he saw things from a human perspective. All people were born with the understanding that they would die one day. Thus, the flowers bloomed only because they wished to see her. Violet didn't understand why they chose that instead of waiting for spring. The saint replied that for living beings, only the present matters. The flowers preferred the now to a ghostly future. They made their choice, accepting all the pain that would entail. She caressed the girl's cheek and told her not to be too sad. The saint smiled and said that she could overcome everything before disappearing. Violet woke up suddenly at dawn. As simple as that, she was amazed at how vivid dreams could become. She looked at her hand. Realizing that she even used her power, Violet tried to replicate what happened in the dream. And she saw a bright light. It struck her to learn how to shape the power in a single dream. After preparing, she decided she needed to go out for a walk. Anne noticed her confusion and asked what had her so thoughtful. The girl avoided the answer, and Anne reminded her of her plans. The maid recounted that she was born and raised right in that mansion. She loved that place, despite the intense cold and harsh climate. 3 young masters were also born and grew up here, before moving to the capital. The maid smiled and pointed out a tree in the distance. She said it was the oldest on the estate and that her mother loved it. For some reason, it refused to bloom and withered. Violet accidentally discovered that Anne's mother had also passed away. She became sad realizing that the Marquis's children had also lost their mother in childhood. She didn't understand why she thought her suffering was greater than others. Violet felt a pang of conscience for her previous thoughts. Anne suddenly remembered that there was a stable on the other side of the estate. The girl couldn't refuse, and they decided to go visit it. She was fascinated with the atmosphere, even with the smell. The stable boy accidentally discovered 2 intrigued girls. That stable boy was Anne's elderly grandfather. He couldn't believe it when he supposed that a saint was by his side. He tried to bow, showing respect for having traveled so far. The man added that it was a great honor for him and that he was happy. They continued chatting about trivial things, but Violet wasn't listening. She was amazed that there were so many horses on the estate. She quickly passed by the adults and ran towards a horse. The stable boy called a boy and told him to greet the saint. The girl froze upon seeing the one called Tommy. For some reason, his face seemed terribly familiar to her. The boy shyly stepped forward and greeted the saint. As soon as she saw his face, she recognized him instantly. It was an acquaintance. Violet remembered her days, those she spent in the slums. She wanted to play with everyone, but she was a complete outcast. Everyone saw her as the miserable daughter of the butcher shop. Even parents considered her unworthy to play with their children. Violet wanted to run away from all that, but then they called her. A bully laughed and asked if she wanted to play with them. The girl looked at the boy Tommy and nodded insistently. The other children laughed when he suggested playing hide-and-seek. Violet was happy and found a perfect hiding spot, waiting to be found. Unfortunately, they tricked her and she remained there until late at night. She understood everything when her parents found her after sunset. She burst into tears, realizing they never intended to play with her. After that incident, she only watched their games from a distance. She was surprised at how much Tommy tried to ingratiate himself with her. She thought he didn't recognize her and focused her gaze on a beautiful horse. He tried to talk to her, but she didn't understand the language of large animals. Violet approached the horse, wondering if she would understand when she grew up. Tommy was startled when he remembered that this horse could be unruly. He started to worry that the animal might harm the saint. What a surprise when he saw the animal's calmness. The saint's gentle gaze revealed that she had everything under control. Their eyes met and suddenly, Tommy blushed with embarrassment. The girl was puzzled by his reaction and decided to find out directly. After a brief silence, she asked him if he remembered her. The boy pretended not to understand anything and was surprised by her question. He recognized her as Violet after she took off her beret. He found it incredible that she had actually become a saint. The girl smiled and said that was absolutely true. Her hands clenched when he reminded her that she was a commoner. He held his head, unable to believe that someone like her could be a saint. The boy tried to justify himself, saying that previous saints were aristocrats. Although it hurt her, she understood that he was right. She decided to change the subject and asked him to feed the horses. While feeding them, the boy admitted that from afar she looked like a real lady. The saint was happy, thinking she had absorbed all the lessons well. The boy calmly asked how her parents were doing. Violet darkened, but still recounted their tragic end. Inevitably, she remembered the day they died before her eyes. Unfortunately, they were annihilated in the cruelest way possible. Tommy clumsily recounted that his father had passed away, but his mother and grandmother were still alive. The girl inwardly celebrated that at least someone from the village survived. Tommy explained that his mother worked outside the village, and his grandmother was bedridden due to an illness. He added that his mother and grandmother argued daily without cease. In the past, these women were famous for their sour and quarrelsome temper. Tommy was the only one capable of earning a decent living. He smiled and told Violet that she was very lucky to be a saint. The girl froze, feeling her experience being devalued. She recognized in her mind that it had been hard for her too, and almost nothing had changed. There wasn't a second she felt at peace, and without fear of making a mistake. Furthermore, people kept criticizing and laughing behind her back. She suffocated with terror thinking about overthrowing Malum. However, she couldn't afford to complain in front of him. Violet decided to support the boy at least a little. She took the warm scarf from her neck and wrapped it around him. He was amazed by this sudden care, but she just smiled. The boy caressed the soft scarf and smiled shyly in response. Suddenly, he hid his gaze and called her by name. Tommy sincerely confessed that he regretted bothering her. They chatted like that until sunset. Violet left the stable and returned with the maid. Anne smiled to herself upon seeing the boy with her scarf. She smiled and took off her warm wool shawl. The maid carefully covered the girl and asked if she enjoyed seeing the horses. She also supposed that the scent of vegetation had intensified due to Violet's good mood. Suddenly, Anne remembered how sad the girl was about the plants. She only remembered the words of the saint from the dream and dismissed those thoughts. The girl said that she now controlled her power better. Anne smiled sweetly and suggested having Coco in the mansion. Violet reacted joyfully to this kind proposition. Since then, several very similar days passed. Anne happily noticed that the saint had a better appetite. She overheard that lately she frequented the stable. The servants gossiped about her closeness with a boy. The steward said that any lackey was suitable for a commoner saint. They immediately switched to the topic of the origin of Saint Doncella. The servants talked about this until they saw Anne's fury. She scared everyone away immediately, forcing them to work. The steward remembered that he could not ignore the daughter of the influential Marquis. Although he was called steward, it was hard to believe. Anne suddenly realized that she was the only one doing her job in the mansion. She couldn't say anything to the others, as she herself was only a servant. Even so, she was willing to care for the lady as if she were 10 people. Meanwhile, the saint was absorbed in reading a new book. Anne enjoyed seeing how hard she tried. She decided to hint to the saint that she hadn't found the scarf for 2 days. The girl sweated nervously when Anne started thinking about it. She said she had thrown it away when Anne asked if she was aware. The maid almost laughed at her childish naivety. She decided to ask directly about that stable boy. The saint stumbled when she asked if he was her friend in the past. Anne left, saying she couldn't afford to interrupt her happiness. Violet was surprised by her calm reaction. Anne made the bed and said that she should still pay attention to what people say. Violet instantly understood everything her maid was implying. She thoughtfully clutched the book and said this was already too much. The girl didn't want to give up her friendship for fear of being judged. Anne froze when the girl repeated her words, visibly distressed. She put the book aside, and after that, the maid withdrew. That same night, Violet contacted the saint again. The girl sincerely told her about her worries that day. The saint explained that the maid only wanted to take care of her. Violet understood that Anne was only worried, but still felt bad. The saint caressed her and told her she didn't want to make her cry. Violet found it amazing that this wise woman could see everything. She decided to find out her identity, but she only answered with an enigma. The girl immediately started considering different response options. Finally, she asked her directly if she was a goddess. The woman smiled mockingly and said that her answer was very interesting. She replied that now Violet was her goddess. Her answer was so complex that Violet unintentionally got confused. The woman caressed her hands and told her she could consider her however she wished. She gave another sweet smile and promised she would find out everything. Violet said she had already seen someone resembling a god. She added that he had golden eyes and silver hair. The goddess smiled, pointing out that she had already met that boy. Violet thought she knew something about him, but she just turned her head silently. The goddess assured that the maiden would remain on her side, without hesitation. Her words planted in Violet the idea of offering her apologies. The saint smiled, encouraging her to do it if she really wished. The day came, but the young woman did not find the courage to apologize. She thought that Anne might also be angry with her after what happened. Tommy noticed her presence and told her that lately she hadn't been visiting him. The boy dropped the straw and told her that his grandmother had relapsed again. Sadly, the young woman suggested they call a healer. She barely pronounced those words when he looked at her with contempt. He reminded her that his family didn't have money to afford it. In reality, Violet hadn't visited Tommy because she complained and became more insolent. She understood where he wanted to go, but she couldn't help him at all. The girl decided to give him the only thing she really had available. She thought that he could call a doctor if he sold the gems from her eyes. Unfortunately, this gesture only managed to anger the poor boy even more. He threw the bear on the ground and asked her what the hell use that would be. Tommy was snorting full of rage, as if he wanted to tear her to pieces right there. Violetta froze upon seeing her beloved teddy bear thrown on the floor. She wanted to do the right thing, but look, everything turned against her. Tommy started shouting that she didn't understand anything and that he didn't need anything. He added that she couldn't understand his situation because he has no one. Violet couldn't stand it anymore and ended up shouting at him with all her might. He flinched when she asked him what the hell he knew about her. She wished she had a family, but all her loved ones were dead. She added that he didn't even know where or how she grew up. She also had nothing, and on top of that, she suffered constant physical abuse. Violet cried, sadly showing that it had been hard for her too. It seems Tommy didn't even imagine she would open up like that. The girl approached and proudly picked up her dirt-covered toy. She said that this object was very valuable to her, as it was her first birthday gift. Violetta, disappointed, ended the topic, saying she would never come back. She ran off in the opposite direction, without waiting for a single answer. Meanwhile, Anne was surprised not to find the lady in the stable. It seemed to her that yesterday she had been in a bad mood all day long. She kept thinking nonstop about how she could improve her mood. Anne froze upon hearing strange noises coming from the room. Unexpectedly, she caught Violetta washing her beloved toy. The maid immediately inspected the surroundings cautiously. She was furious because the other maids didn't even help her carry water. Anne bit her lip angrily, restraining herself with all her might. She asked for the bear to be passed over, but the saint flatly refused. The girl said she was good at washing, although that didn't console Anne. She was worried that the little one seemed more secure washing than reading. She imagined how hard her life must have been to get used to that. Violet felt a warm hug and was about to burst into tears. The girl cried, saying she had absolutely no one in the world. Despite everything, people kept murmuring horrible things about her. She no longer knew if it was really her fault that this was happening. The girl burst into tears when Anne told her it wasn't her fault. After a while, Violet finally felt great relief. She nodded, indicating she had calmed down a bit. Anne promised she would clean the bear, and it would look like new. She smiled when the saint modestly thanked her. Violet reproached herself for getting angry with the one who always comforted her. She couldn't apologize with words, but an idea came to her mind. The saint turned to Anne and asked her to accompany her to a place. They went directly to the tree, illuminated by the night moon. Anne tried to figure out why she had decided to come precisely there. The saint recalled that Anne's mother wanted to see the tree bloom. The maid agreed, but it was impossible due to her old age. What a surprise she had when the saint said she would help. She advanced silently, preparing to use a bit of magic. The girl touched the trunk of the tree and began to concentrate. Slowly, her hands lit up, showing a blue glow. Anne was shocked by the abilities of the young envoy of God. She couldn't believe what she was seeing. The tree's branches grew nonstop. In the end, the tree grew to an incredible and real size. Anne thought she would never see it again. But her dream came true. She had buried that scent with her memories. But it was real again. Violetta stood on tiptoe, trying to pluck a single flower. She held out the flower, implying it was an apology for yesterday. Anne's heart warmed just thinking about it. How sweet. She was totally captivated by that incredible and kind Lady Violet. Every day she understood maternally that it was simply impossible not to love her. The maid sincerely thanked the lady for that miracle and smiled. The next morning arrived, when Anne was forced to leave the estate. She doubted until the last moment that everything would turn out well. Phew, the saint reassured Anne. She was only leaving for a quiet week. It turned out her father had fallen ill and needed to be replaced. Violet encouraged her to take this trip and asked her to deliver a letter. Anne accepted the request and asked if she had a letter for the Marquis. The girl prepared the letter, but worried about possible mistakes. The maid convinced her that the man would be happy with any news. She stroked her and told her that she had even sent her very beautiful fur clothing. This gave her confidence, and she agreed to deliver the envelope. Anne hid the envelope safely and headed to her carriage. She climbed the stairs and promised she would return soon. Violet smiled and told her to spend more time with her father. She waved her hand cheerfully, watching the carriage move away. The saint wanted to return peacefully to the estate, but something stopped her. She saw Tommy, who was walking towards her, visibly confused. He was the one who had been preparing the horses, meditating the whole time. She noticed his desire to talk, but she couldn't forgive his mistake. She left, still not wanting to see him near her, not even a little. A new day dawned, which Violet witnessed with genuine surprise. She got up drowsily, wondering why Anne hadn't woken her up. A deathly silence reminded her that Violet was in the capital. As expected, after her departure, the maids neglected her even more. Even the attention from the assigned maid was very different from Anne's. Apparently, the maids only wanted to gossip and talk about the saint. They often forgot to take care of her, but she took care of everything. In addition to that, she spent most of her time in the library. She went every day to research new books ceaselessly. In one of those days, a book about the history of Greece fell into her hands. It again mentioned the importance of the saint. The saint sacrificed herself for the entire country, which is why her status was the highest. By law, she received the protection of the Pope and the king. The girl doubted this and remembered a lesson with the countess. The countess told her about Pope Lindo, whose identity was hidden. Involuntarily, the saint wondered if they would ever meet. She remembered that there were only 2 days left until Anne returned. She froze upon hearing a knock on the door behind her. The saint revealed her presence in the library by dropping a book. She turned thoughtfully, trying to understand who it could be. It seemed strange to her, as the maids never looked for her there. She cautiously approached the door and asked who it was. To her surprise, the stranger didn't bother to answer. She felt a threat, but her curiosity was stronger. The girl gathered her courage and decided to open the door. She was even more amazed to see an acquaintance. In front of her was Tommy, frozen by the snowstorm. She wanted to say something, but he lunged at her instantly. He almost began to beg her to save his sick grandmother. The boy begged her to save her with her sacred power. Violet was stunned by the surprise and abruptly pulled her hand back. She slammed the door shut so no one would hear and asked how he got in. She demanded that he return quickly before they found him. He froze when she added that she didn't have such power. The girl said that, even if she had it, she couldn't leave without permission. The boy approached and said that she could heal thanks to sacred power. He kept denying her words, but the truth is she knew nothing about that. She lowered her head guiltily and begged him, once again, to leave. What a surprise when that insolent boy fell to his knees. He pleaded with her to at least visit his grandmother to lift her spirits. She couldn't afford it, but his tears tore her soul apart. The girl kept watching how he, in tears, implored her. Tommy said he only needed to show his face to his grandmother. He appealed to her pity, telling her that she hadn't helped him at all. Violet remained firm and said the guards would catch them. Tommy said he knew a secret passage, so he could leave and return. She bit her lip, feeling the internal struggle between two sides. He was her only friend from the village, and he pleaded for help with such anguish. She thought nothing bad would happen and agreed to help him with his problem. The girl thoughtfully said she needed to return as soon as possible. Tommy jumped for joy and began to effusively thank her for her help. Afterwards, the girl put on her hood and prepared for action. They looked tensely from the doorway, analyzing every detail of the place. Tommy was pleased to see the mansion hallway completely empty. They ran towards the exit, hoping no one would discover them there. Violet followed the boy, believing she would return home without fail. Meanwhile, the Marquis was sitting thoughtfully in his study. He was still turning over the letter written by his adoptive daughter. He tapped it clumsily with his finger, as if afraid to open it. Anne remained tense nearby, waiting for him to finally decide. She saw he was anxious, but still, he held back somehow. He opted to ask her how her father was doing after the illness. The Marquis proposed that she return to the estate with Daniel. The next instant, Adrian burst into the study full of energy. He shouted at the top of his lungs, saying that he would also go to the estate. He was not happy that his brothers were going and he was staying here. It turned out that, in addition to Daniel, Eselund was also going to the estate. The Marquis ignored his whim and listed Anne's requirements. The young woman agreed and then tried to calm the boy down. Beorn, tired of his son's whims, finally allowed him to go. He knew that a festival would soon be held in the west to celebrate spring. On the first night of the week-long festival, a member of the feudal family had to launch the first lantern. Only after that could every resident launch their own lantern. Thinking about it, the Marquis finally decided to open the letter. He carefully opened the envelope and then began to read. A smile formed on his face as he read his adoptive daughter's clumsy lines. He didn't even suspect the dangerous step she had agreed to take. The girl couldn't imagine that there could be a secret passage in the mansion. Fortunately, Tommy knew the time of the guard change, and they were able to pass. Doubt invaded her thinking about how far her home was from the mansion. Violetta froze upon hearing him say they had arrived. Before her appeared a small, dilapidated house that evidenced the poverty of its owners. As soon as the door opened, Tommy called for his grandmother. Violetta took a step forward and heard a loud creak of the floorboards. Her blood ran cold when she saw the woman chained to the bed. Tommy's grandmother breathed with difficulty, as if slowly dying with every breath. The gloomy surroundings only intensified the scene. Violet was in shock, but before that she was healthy. The girl approached the bed, doubting if she could help. She knew very well that she didn't yet have the power to save her. The saint touched the old woman's hand and decided to do something. She released energy, so as not to suffer remorse later. At that moment, the sleeping woman opened her eyes. She seemed to want to give a signal to the boy behind her. He trembled with shame and bitterly begged Violet for forgiveness. The girl looked around, not knowing it was a trap. Instantly, a crowd of men burst into the room. They surrounded the little girl, terrifying her with their malicious laughter. She looked sadly at the one she sincerely wanted to help. He clutched his head and trembled, begging for forgiveness nonstop. Violet screamed for the first time, incredulous at what he dragged her into. The terrible villains kept looming over her. They started mocking her, not believing she was really a saint. With every new word, Tommy apologized more insistently. It seemed he himself was disgusted by what he had done. Nevertheless, his mother congratulated him on what he had achieved. As soon as he entered the room, a bandit roughly grabbed Violet's hand. He laughed, saying the boss would surely love her hair. The girl felt pain in her wrist and called for Tommy. He trembled and said he had no other choice due to the cost of treatment. The bandit slapped him on the shoulder and told him he couldn't trick the saint. He laughed and said it was to pay for his mother's drinks. He added that, although Tommy earned good money, he had never called the doctor. It turned out that, all this time, he had been paying for his mother's binges. She collapsed on the floor, begging them to stop saying all that. It seems Violet realized that even the boy had been deceived. She thought, unintentionally, that he had betrayed her for a drink. His mother calmly extended her arms towards the bandit. He paid her a couple of coins and said he would intercede for her with the boss. The man ordered that the saint's eyes be bandaged and her mouth gagged. She tried to break free and said she needed to return as soon as possible. The girl froze when a mercenary's sharp axe appeared in front of her. He suggested they not bother each other and just sit in silence. The mercenary smiled mockingly and said that torturing children was not his hobby. He hadn't finished speaking when the saint suddenly touched the axe. The man screamed and quickly pulled his hand away from the sharp axe. They couldn't allow her to have blemishes. They would pay less for her. The girl looked at her former friend as they put the bag over her head. Hope abandoned her, and tears blurred her vision. She wondered if it would have been easier if Tommy had done it for his grandmother. The mercenaries carried her on their shoulders and took her out of the house. With her eyes blindfolded, the girl tightly squeezed the cut. She wanted to leave evidence. She remembered the Duke's words. Her blood was a divine gift. Violet didn't know if it would work, but she held on to hope. Meanwhile, the Marquis' sons arrived at the mansion. Eselund narrowed his eyes, as if noticing something strange. Daniel asked Anne if everything was like this before their departure. The girl looked ahead cautiously, searching for differences. Finally, they discovered real chaos in the mansion. All the servants were in a panic over the saint's sudden disappearance. The man lowered his head when the firstborn asked what was happening. Not a trace of his former arrogance remained in him. The man moved restlessly, not knowing how to explain everything. Daniel noticed the tense atmosphere and asked what was going on. It seems Eselund guessed what was happening and asked about the saint. The man trembled even more and began to beg for forgiveness again. He was ready to die, but the firstborn's gaze conveyed something else. The man closed his eyes tightly from fear and said she was gone. Ayn was so shocked that her purse even fell from her hands. The younger brother was surprised, as the mansion had the best security. The man agreed, but they still couldn't find the lady. Eselund felt the frustration of really not having been able to foresee anything. He realized that he hadn't even imagined she could disappear. He didn't even foresee her sobs in the garden during her birthday. Ed understood that at that moment, she was acting on pure whim. He felt anger thinking that she had fled intentionally. The young man gathered his courage and ordered all servants and knights to assemble. With complete seriousness, he declared that he himself would lead the search. In a matter of minutes, an army formed in front of him. Ed gave orders sternly, but Anne only thought of one thing. She knew the girl couldn't have escaped or left with a stranger. As soon as she thought of a possibility, she immediately headed to Ed. She knew the girl well and affirmed that they should check the stables. After those words, they quickly headed there. There, the stable boy told them that the saint and Tommy had argued, and she hadn't returned. He surprised them by saying that today was the first time Tommy hadn't shown up. The man recalled that Tommy lived on a nearby dock. As soon as they entered the slums, Ed ordered them to stop. Bright flowers sprouting from sacred tears caught his attention. Eselund tightened the reins, understanding that something had made her cry. He changed route and followed directly towards where the flowers led. Meanwhile, the girl had been locked in a room for days. From eavesdropping, she learned that they wanted to sell her. Surprisingly, they never hit her. They took her to a warm room and fed her regularly. However, she had almost no appetite due to stress. The girl turned as she felt the leader's gaze upon her. He said that, as a representative of a god, she deserved all praise. The man added that she would be a very valuable item, even as a slave. They tried to stop him, but he didn't believe in the existence of any god. He spoke very harshly about the Pope and called Violet a mutant. A smile lit up his face upon being notified of the arrival of the merchants. Violet felt an animal fear upon learning that her client was there. Just a few minutes later, they tied her up and dragged her into the street, like a cow. She kept squeezing blood from her cut. From what she heard, she began to fear they wanted to sell her to the Pope. The boss kept morally pressuring his subordinates. He trembled, trying to guess who they would finally sell her to. The man said his client was neither a pope nor a marquis. He looked towards the gloomy crowd and said his client was from Gunnar. Violet froze upon hearing the familiar name of the village. She remembered that day the countess told her about him. That village aggressively rejected the doctrine of the absolute God. The barbaric Gunnar people worshipped a god called Great Spirit. They were coarse by nature and wanted to invade aggressively, but Saint Anastasia destroyed them. Since then, a huge country called Kuharati was created. In it, they gave different names to their leaders. Instantly, the said Kagan appeared before her. She became even more agitated, which brought a smile to the leader's face. He said he doubted they would kill her, as they had paid such a high price. It seems his complacent phrase only scared the girl more. She froze, looking fearfully at the foreign representatives. Kagan slowly approached the girl, as if analyzing her. The man approached the child and examined her mark. She kept looking at him, not understanding what they would do to her next. Kagan ordered her gag to be removed, according to the translator. The leader, without further questions, began to untie the gag. Finally, the gag fell from her mouth, and she could breathe normally. She didn't understand why this man was smiling that way. He kept staring at her fixedly with his cunning green eyes. He scanned her with his gaze when he found not a drop of blood. Kagan quickly grabbed her hand and noticed a cut on it. He immediately went to the boss and demanded a bunch of things from him. The girl darkened as she realized they had discovered her plan. The boss smiled mockingly, supposing she wanted to leave a mark. His eyes opened in surprise as he looked behind her. He saw how flowers magically grew from the drops of her blood. The leader grabbed her shoulder and looked furiously into her eyes. Violet felt panic, as she was ignorant of what the future held for her. The very next instant, she was on the floor from a slap. He burned with rage because her location had been discovered. Violet closed her eye, noticing how her lips and cheeks were swelling. Kagan immediately shouted at the leader for hitting the saint. He was absorbed in the argument until he saw something unusual. He saw how the saint pressed her palms against the ground. In the next instant, plants began to grow everywhere. Tribe 1 was stunned by the miracle of the Holy Maiden. The leader howled with rage and lunged, wanting to kill the girl. He didn't manage to touch her. When reinforcements rushed towards them, Violet raised her head, surprised, and she saw familiar faces. She discovered that her older brother had almost shattered the mercenary's arm. It happened so fast that the bastard didn't even have time to flinch. Instantly, his hand tragically fell into the water along with the sword. Ed lowered his bloodied sword and said it was an order from Marquis Hermingard. Violet shivered, realizing she was now safe. Ed ordered no one left alive, except those from the Gunnar tribe. The tribesmen rushed to protect their leader. The clash of swords resonated, and the mercenaries fell defeated. Violet kept turning over her brother's words about Marquis Ermingard's order. She tried to remember where she had heard something similar before. Ed felt the girl's gaze and observed her sternly. Violet looked down in surprise upon being lifted into arms. Eselund introduced himself harshly, stating his name and title. He brandished his sword, warning that his country was no man's land. His gaze fixed on Kagan, surrounded by his people. The young man kept pointing the sword and ordered them to return to their land. His opponent only carefully observed Saint Violet. He felt her gaze and returned the look with surprise. With a slight smile, he uttered a phrase whose meaning was obscure. Eselund frowned upon hearing the last word. The girl shivered, feeling completely confused. She was surprised that Kagan decided to leave so easily. A soldier ran towards them, happy to have found the saint. Eselund turned silently towards the girl and untied her hands. He asked them to tell Sir Besselhound to get out of there. Afterwards, he put his sister on the horse and rode forward. Violet looked around and saw a pile of bloody corpses. She shivered in fear, but an unfamiliar voice told her not to worry. The girl looked at the horse, as if it were the one telling her not to be afraid. Violet could hear the voice of such a large animal for the first time. Meanwhile, Eselund remained deep in thought. A phrase spoken by the leader kept running through his head. It meant that he, without a doubt, would take what belonged to him. He continued thinking aloud until they reached the estate. There, a worried Daniel immediately greeted them. He shouted when he saw the bruised little girl. He had been so worried all this time that he couldn't help hugging her. Violet was surprised by such a sudden explosion of feelings. She observed the others and deduced that they had arrived together. Only now did she finally understand everything that had happened to her. The girl unleashed her emotions and cried exhausted. Only Eselund continued watching thoughtfully. He harshly addressed Anne, demanding that she stop encouraging the saint's childish whims. He sternly declared that she must understand the consequences of her choice. Anne didn't understand the reason why he was so strict with Violet. It seemed that even the girl herself was surprised by how much everyone was alarmed. Anne asked if it was really necessary to go that far. Ed reminded her that she must not talk back and must take responsibility. Finally, he decided to settle the matter and ordered her to follow him. His face showed absolute and unwavering determination. No one knew what he was plotting, but everyone obeyed his demand without hesitation. They entered a large hall where everyone was lined up in a straight row. As the victim, Violet had to stay next to Ed without talking back. She clenched her hands tightly, not understanding why this situation occurred. The young woman tensed upon hearing the sound of doors opening. Her astonishment was immense upon seeing Tommy suddenly appear in the hall. Upon seeing Tommy's family, the firstborn said he occupied that place in the name of his father. The three of them began to beg him with tears in their eyes to forgive them. Ed listed the infractions they had managed to commit. The woman tried to say that things hadn't been that way. She said they were only following orders from others under threats. Ed recalled that it was the saint who should protect their lands. He added that with their action, they had wished to destroy the country. The woman fell down in fear, understanding the price of her mistake. She said she knew nothing about the Gujarati or any other people. Tommy's mother justified herself to the end, but this provoked laughter. He said she had no right to hand over the saint. Eselund slowly descended, radiating absolute terror. He stood over the offenders, who threatened the entire kingdom. Ed asked why his sick grandmother looked so lively. Tommy trembled, saying that the saint's power had stopped the illness. Eselund looked at the girl, as if expecting an answer. He declared that the saint, for the first time, granted a blessing. Immediately after, he drew his sword and beheaded the impostor. Anne shivered in fright, reluctant to witness the bloodshed. Tommy watched his grandmother's death as if it were a movie. Eselund threatened in a thunderous voice that he would execute them instantly. Tommy's mother raised her hands and began to beg him to save him. Tommy decided to influence Violet and begged her to help him. She didn't want to hear his pleas after such a betrayal. However, she did not wish for his death and responded to his pleas. Yielding to a feeling of pity, she ran towards Eselund. With tears in her eyes, she begged her brother not to do it. Violet was even willing to take all the blame, just to save them. Ed replied that she had to be aware of the consequences of her decision. She said she understood everything and begged him to spare their lives. The blade in his hand stopped when she added that Tommy was her only friend from the village. He coldly ordered her to understand her place. The girl reacted and screamed when he raised his hand again. She clutched her cloak and watched the woman's head roll off. Automatically, all the pain she had suffered overwhelmed her. She remembered how the soldiers mocked her dead sister. Something inside her broke when they compared her head to a ball. This incident forced her to understand the price of all her decisions. If she was sold to another state, her country could face ruin. What happened was not her fault, and the execution of those people was expected. However, this whole chain of deaths tormented her sensitive soul. She froze like a statue when Anne visited her room. The young woman said fearfully that Violet had slept for 3 consecutive days. The saint continued to look at the maid with complete indifference. Seeing her lost and battered appearance, Anne's heart shrank. She quickly hugged the girl, wishing to offer her support. Anne understood how difficult it was for her, but asked how she was. Violet still hadn't found the strength to answer. After a brief silence, she said with resignation that she didn't want to live. She didn't know that one of the sons was observing their conversation. Now nothing mattered to her more than alleviating her pain. She stared at the ceiling, lost, repeating that she wanted to die. After those words, Eselund quietly left the room. He left slowly, leaving the girls alone. Despite the saint's kidnapping, they proceeded with the operation. It was secret and consisted of eliminating the smugglers' organization. It was done to prevent the Pope from having any influence. The servants were scared, but everything ended with the purge of leaders. Days passed, but the emptiness in Violet's chest didn't go away. She turned when she heard Daniel asking what she was doing. The girl thoughtfully replied that she was just reading a book. He tried to cheer her up, gently stroking her head. She herself knew that all of this was cruel and wrong. Daniel mentally noted that, since that day, she hadn't smiled again. He longed to see her smile and told her that his aunt would visit them soon. He anticipated Violet's surprise and told her that she was his father's sister. She married a count and resided further north than where they were. He added that she had a daughter, Annabella, the same age as Violet. Daniel kindly wished that both could become friends. Violet didn't reply, as that didn't matter to her at all. That same day, her younger brother, Adrian, came to visit her. He tried to get the saint's attention, telling her how bored he was. He constantly distracted her from reading, which slowly enraged her. Violet complained and told him to go outside and simply take a walk. The boy stuck out his tongue indignantly and said that was disgusting. He also wished she would call him by his name, like the others. Violet agreed to his request, which stunned the boy. He couldn't believe she would finally call him as he wished. Adrian was over the moon happy after such a reward. He smiled cheerfully and called her little sister in return. The girl turned the page thoughtfully and said she was also in shock. The boy timidly asked if she had been scared. He tried to organize his thoughts, but it was terribly difficult for him. Although he seemed clumsy, he sincerely wanted to support her. Adrian swallowed with difficulty, concentrating while waiting for the saint's reaction, and he extended his hand towards her. Violet thought he would hit her, but he only stroked her clumsily. It seems even he didn't fully understand what he was trying to do. He quickly tidied the strands of hair, escaping from his face. Adrian promised that next time, he would tell her not to do it anymore. The saint coldly replied that she didn't believe those words. She saw his astonishment and snapped that she had never listened to him. She looked down and added, almost in a whisper, that it wasn't her fault. It was terribly clear now. She was not like the others. The saint felt with certainty that she could no longer be friends with Tommy. From now on, she had to be above and look down on them. She suspected it before, but only now did she truly understand it. Adrian watched the girl, afraid she would cry again. He tried to tell her that she could cry in front of him, if she needed to. The girl shouted at her brother, showing her total disagreement. She looked him in the eyes and understood that he only wanted to comfort her. He had done it before, just in a rather peculiar way. At first she was scared, but now talking to him made her smile. After several days, the Marquis' sister finally arrived. That aristocratic woman walked in the company of her daughter. Daniel was the first to welcome the guests to the mansion. Violet, thoughtfully, began to examine her contemporary. She quickly came to the conclusion that it was Annabella herself. She didn't manage to greet her when she threw herself into Daniel's arms. Annabella started saying how much she missed him, but the boy asked her to greet the saint. His mother immediately clung to those words and said she didn't know anything about that. The girl replied, modestly, not to pay attention to her. The woman openly ignored her words and addressed Daniel. Annabella immediately started complaining that Ed was not in the mansion. That excessive sweetness instantly provoked disgust in Adrian. The countess scolded him, saying he should be friendly. Adrian ostentatiously approached Violet and called her his sister. The girl was stunned by such an unexpected display of affection. He quickly took Violet's hand and suggested they leave. It seems Annabella now hates Saint Violet even more. Once in the room, Adrian declared how much he hated that girl. He collapsed on Violet's bed and continued hating Annabella out loud. Adrian deliberately hid in the saint's room so they wouldn't find him. He repeated once again how much he hated Annabella. Violet clearly saw that he was not lying to her about it. The saint concluded that this girl was beautiful and that Daniel liked her. Adrian, as if reading her mind, said that the commoner Violet was much better than her. He added with certainty that she was much sweeter and kinder. Anne flared up at his bold words, lacking all courtesy. She immediately threw him out of the saint's room. The next morning, Annabella invited the girl for tea. She acted sickeningly sweet and was glad to have a new friend. The saint smiled in response and said it was an honor for her. Annabella was frustrated by how impeccable the saint's manners were. Violet accidentally noticed a doll sitting in a corner. It looked very similar to the one the Marquis had given her before. It seems Annabella detected the gaze of the girl she hated so much. She smiled cunningly and waited for her brother Ed to return soon. The girl said he was very kind and always gave her guided tour. The saint was surprised to learn about her older brother's coldness. She immediately thought that he wouldn't have acted that way if Annabella were his sister. Violetta was so absorbed in her thoughts that she didn't even listen. The guest decided to take the opportunity and offered her the doll. She assumed that Violetta wanted precisely that doll. She smiled and asked her to accept it as a sign of the beginning of their friendship. Violetta didn't want to seem discourteous and finally accepted the doll. The next instant, Daniel approached them with the servants. The saint turned upon seeing Annabella throwing herself at him again. She hugged him tightly and clung to him, calling him her brother. She burst into tears and begged him to buy her another doll. Annabella sadly declared that her doll already belonged to the saint. Daniel could hardly believe that the saint was taking the doll. The servants loudly criticized Violet, attracting her mother. The woman jumped to hasty conclusions upon seeing the doll and the tears. She angrily asked why the saint had Annabella's doll. The saint explained, with confusion, that a lady had given her the doll. The woman dismissed it as absurd, since it was a gift from her father. Daniel supported Annabella and asked for the doll to be returned. The girl insisted that it was fine and that the saint seemed to want it. Her mother asked her why she had given away her favorite doll so easily. The saint returned the doll, but the woman refused to accept it. She judged Violet and decided to buy her daughter a better doll. Everyone kept dwelling on the tearful Annabella without understanding anything. Only Violet was left completely alone, holding a useless doll. She returned to the room where Adrian was hiding again. Anne cheerfully pushed Adrian and rejoiced for the saint. It seems even the boy took an interest in the appearance of the girl. He saw her dejected look and asked her what doll she held in her hands. Violet broke down and told Anne that she had been wrong about everything. She decided to tell them everything that had happened, which caused indignation. Violet also didn't know why Annabella had decided to do all this. Adrian called that girl a little demon, ruining everyone's life. Anne added that the countess was ready to fight with her. She called it the true manifestation of a fight between aristocrats. Violet was shocked by the absurdity of this whole situation. Now everyone believed she was arrogant, not knowing she had a much better doll. She felt confusion, not understanding why this situation had arisen. The saint's reputation was already nil because of her origin. She didn't understand why Annabelle needed her to get even worse. Everyone already loved her, but she decided to elevate herself at the expense of the saint. Adrian noticed her confusion and told her to trust him. It infuriated him that she didn't take his words seriously. Time passed, and Violet's lonely days became warmer. She wanted to resolve the misunderstanding with Daniel, but it was in vain. Adrian visited her in her room from time to time with a smile. He couldn't figure out what she was up to, but he was sure he suspected something. On one of those days, he took out a worm and started scaring Annabella. He chased her all over the property, as if wanting revenge. The boy saw the saint and smiled happily at her. He believed it was fair, since Violet was accused of stealing a doll. The boy chased her until she collapsed on the ground. Annabella declared she had only told the truth, nothing more. She tried to catch the saint when she told her brother another version. Annabella also suspected that she was the one who ordered her to harass her. Adrian jumped up instantly, affirming that he acted on his own. Annabella replied that she had been watching his plot very closely. She also mentioned the insects he had secretly put in her shoes. She pointed her finger at Violet and shouted that it was her order. Her order? The saint replied that they never discussed anything like that with Adrian. She spent almost all her time in her room, so everything was a lie. The saint directly asked why she hated her for no reason. She also asked why she had cried when giving her the doll. She added that she already had a doll, a gift from the Marquis. Annabella decided to act differently and cried even harder. Violet was stunned by the manipulative behavior of the guest. She got what she wanted, and Daniel ran upon hearing her sobs. Annabella started saying that Adrian and the saint were conspiring. The maids immediately supported her, saying they always made fun of the girl. One of them suggested that the saint had been taught that in the flower street. Her words provoked Daniel, and he ordered them to watch their words. He looked so terrifying that the maids immediately started whimpering. Anne defended the saint, assuring that she had nothing to do with it. Another maid revealed that Adrian constantly visited the saint's room. Anne demanded proof that the saint controlled Adrian. Daniel declared that he could not fully trust the maid. He harshly addressed Violet and asked how long she would continue causing trouble. Daniel repeated the same words, this time directed at Annabella. He demanded that Violet show mercy towards the saint. The young man severely demanded that she apologize first. Violet burned with injustice and refused to apologize. Despite everything, she didn't want to ruin her relationship with Daniel. She swallowed her pride and apologized to Annabella. The girl coldly said that what happened was a misunderstanding. After those words, a smile of satisfaction lit up Annabella's face. She hugged the saint and told her everything was fine. Right in her ear, she whispered that a commoner like her could not compete with her. Then, discreetly, she pushed the girl and asked her to grant her wish. She pointed her finger at Anne and asked them to lend her to her while they were there. She said that before in the capital, Anne always took care of her. Anne intervened, saying that she accompanied Lady Violet by Ed's personal order. Annabella smiled and said she would speak to him herself. She added that he always paid attention to her requests. Daniel begged Violet, saying it would only be for a week. Anne wanted to object, but he immediately set a clear limit. He severely declared that he was the one in charge of the mansion now. Violet couldn't refuse, as that could harm Anne. Anne was dumbfounded to see the saint give her consent. Annabella smiled brazenly and thanked the young woman. She looked victoriously at the saint and acknowledged the favor she had shown her. That same night, Daniel went to Violet's room. He stroked her head, noticing how upset she was. The young man said he was very sorry, but he couldn't do anything. The county of Hartford vouched for the northern fourth wall, and they couldn't become enemies. The aunt was distinguished by her difficult character and Annabella by her immaturity. Violet saw how hard all this was for Daniel. He promised that in return, he would assign her other maids. The young man saw her tears and called her his charming little sister. He kissed her on the forehead and told her he always thought of her. That night she felt a hope that soon shattered. Daniel, who had been so kind before, forbade Violet from going to the festival. Shortly before, his own sequence of events had occurred. Eselund walked through bustling streets, running an errand. Suddenly, he remembered the weight of recent events. The young man remembered how Tommy begged him to spare his life. He knew the boy should be executed, but he was incapable. Because of Violet's pleas, he hesitated and found no strength. In his ears still echoed her scream, calling Tommy her friend. After long reflections, he ordered Tommy locked in the dungeon. He hid his sword, looking occasionally at his sleeping sister. She lost consciousness and lay on the floor, in the blood of traitors. He looked intently at her sad and beaten face. Ed justified himself, thinking his father would have done the same. He thought that way that day, until he heard the saint's monologue. His opinion changed when she declared she wanted to die. None of her relatives had ever said anything like that. Even the worker Daniel always kept his smile. From her tone, he understood that this wish was completely sincere. He understood that his methods had driven her to despair. Ed left, tormented by having brought her to that point. Even now, he clearly felt that he had made a mistake. he coincidentally discovered a dialogue of common people preparing for the party. Eselund looked at the sky and remembered that today was the day. Meanwhile, the saint was completely surrounded by maids. Even the standard menu was replaced with her favorite desserts. She missed Anne, but still didn't want to cause conflict. Violet wanted to launch a lantern and decided to ask Daniel. She quickly set off in search of her older brother. She could launch the lantern, even living in the flower street. On the day of the festival, they were not paid attention to, nor insulted. It was a day when they could feel, even if briefly, unity. She discovered that Annabella was already bombarding Daniel with questions. She stopped, looking at the saint with contempt. She glared at her, mockingly holding the young man's hand. He immediately asked Violet what had happened. The girl thoughtfully explained that she had come for a celestial lantern. Annabella burst out laughing and asked if she was also going to the festival. The saint was stunned, not understanding why she was saying all that. She was ready for the earth to swallow her when they forbade her from going to the festival. Daniel explained that it was due to the lack of Eselund's permission. He shrugged and said nothing could be done until his brother arrived. This meant that this year, she would not be able to launch her lantern. Anne wanted to stay with Violet, but Annabella called her. The saint hurried to leave them alone, feeling superfluous. She ran forward, feeling that this was already too much. It hurt, since even in the flower street, she didn't overlook it. She bumped into Adrian unintentionally, who was carrying a lantern. He blocked her way and asked if she had taken his brother's lantern. The boy happily talked about his lantern until he learned about the prohibition. Instantly, he noticed the emptiness in his hands. Adrian thought it was nonsense and told her to take the lantern. However, she understood that they could call her an instigator again. Adrian said he wouldn't go either, but the saint feared new accusations. The boy, powerless, only managed to try to cheer her up a little. Finally, the young woman reached the library door. She stopped and asked them to tell Daniel to have a great time. The saint added that she would not dismiss them and closed the door. A while later, she discovered with surprise that their carriage had already left. The girl, absorbed, walked forward and collapsed heavily on the floor. She hugged herself, and finally, the tears began to flow. Pain and anger flooded her, impossible to hold back any longer. Last year, she was happy with her little sisters, and now she was alone. She was so lonely and hurt that she didn't even hear Ed arrive. He noticed the girl crying and asked what she was doing there. Violet didn't expect him to return today at all. She looked thoughtfully at the one she now hated so strongly. It turned out that he returned just when everyone had left. He asked if everyone had left and received an answer. His astonishment was immense upon learning that the saint was in the library. He immediately ran towards her, not understanding why she stayed alone. The boy wondered what she was doing until he heard sobs. He looked ahead and saw her crying inconsolably, sitting on the floor. Ed again felt a lash of guilt upon seeing the girl. He asked her why she was always crying alone. The young man approached, holding his sword, and asked about Anne. The girl sniffled and said she had left with the countess. He calmly asked her where everyone else was now. She told the truth and was surprised when he asked why she was there. Violet shouted at him, saying he had forbidden her to leave. Her expression made him think he had no idea about anything. She cried again and said that she wouldn't meet anyone there anyway. She added that all this was thanks to her own efforts. The saint broke down crying, saying she had nowhere to run. She kept asking why he had forbidden her. The girl didn't know that he didn't want that to happen. Ed didn't understand why Daniel left her alone and obeyed the order. Suddenly, he realized the influence of the countess's family. Ed understood that the guests' attitude towards Violet was crucial. If everything had gone well, they would have taken her with them. He darkened, concluding that he had failed again. After a pause, Ed ordered the girl to get up from the floor. He calmly approached and offered her his large hand. Violet blamed loneliness for everything, but his voice sounded tender to her. She hesitated, but still decided to accept his hand. A short time later, they reached a clearing where Ed had taken her. Suddenly, the saint noticed that she now looked like a normal person. She looked around, surprised, not understanding where they were. Before, they had climbed a mountain for quite a while. Ed carried her. He suddenly confessed that he used to practice sword fighting there. That allowed him to understand why all the trees were cut down. Night fell, and then Ed started lighting the lanterns. He lit a lantern with the saint's mark and offered it to her. At first she was stunned, but she hurried to take the lantern. He gently handed her this almost weightless festive decoration. Violet finally understood the reason why he had brought her there. When launching the lanterns, there was a special order. The feudal lord had to start. Afterward, all his subjects sent their own lanterns. The girl smiled, wondering if she should wait for Daniel's lantern. Eselund kept looking thoughtfully at Violet. He squeezed the lantern and encouraged her to launch it. The girl protested, thinking it was still too early for that. Ed declared that she was very wrong about certain things. According to him, wherever she is, she must launch the lantern first. After that, he decided to launch his lantern behind hers. Violet realized something so obvious only after his words. Ed held the highest position, and she was on the same level as the king and the pope. It seemed obvious to her, but she was still overlooking it. The girl was ecstatic upon seeing the brilliant landscape before her. Eselund continued to observe her reaction closely. He couldn't even imagine that this view could be so beautiful. Violet admired the lanterns until Ed approached her. He said he was exercising the duties of Marquis Hermengard. He added that his father organized an official reception on her birthday to recognize her as a member of his family. Ed explained that, even if they didn't recognize her, she would still be great. In his opinion, envious people would always try to humiliate her. With that simple truth, he wanted to remind her of her worth. He wanted to teach her, but before that, he had always acted wrongly. The young man hoped she would resist and discover her greatness. He paused briefly and said he would not help her. Ed looked directly into her eyes and ordered her to reclaim what belonged to her. He wasted no time on compassion and wanted to awaken her character. Meanwhile, their lanterns clashed frantically in the air. Eselmund's lamp fell right into the flame, by accident. It caught fire and turned into crackling ashes above their heads. It seems the saint and Ed were so absorbed that they didn't notice. After a while, they finally returned to the mansion. They discovered that Daniel's carriage had also returned. The saint froze upon seeing something surprising. Before her was Annabella, dressed horribly and burning with shame. Her tired mother looked critically at the Marquis's eldest son. She shouted, blaming the saint for forcing the maid to dress the girl like that. Annabella cried, saying that this style was popular in the capital. Violet couldn't believe such a crazy coincidence. Adrian got out of the carriage and said he almost exploded with laughter. The countess indignantly declared that it must have been the saint's order. Violet immediately replied that she hadn't done anything. Anne decided to support her and said it was the truth. The maid began to praise the very expensive, top designer outfit. That monologue made them realize that this creation was Anne's work. The countess continued, accusing the saint of all kinds of sins. She added that her daughter should not suffer humiliation in front of commoners. The countess began to list everything she supposedly accused the saint of. Ed immediately looked at his brother, totally astonished. Adrian affirmed that he had only bothered Annabella. Anne added that she was the one who mentioned Andrebin's creation. She declared that Annabella chose the dress and that they didn't take the doll either. The maid mentioned that the saint already had her favorite toy. Violet was amazed at how incredible Anne was. She defended her so vehemently that Annabella lost her temper. She cried and said that Anne had served her boiling tea. Anne explained her decision and mentioned that she had warned her. She also mentioned how the maid spoke about the saint. Annabella, furious, asked her what they had gotten wrong. The girl continued listing a bunch of things she didn't like. Anne skillfully responded to every complaint from the girl. Annabella trembled when the maid mentioned her weight gain. Unable to bear it, she raised her hand to hit her. The girl looked at the maid with a murderous glare. Anne, with a smile, complied with her order to lower her head. Violet froze, unwilling to allow such a thing. She saw how forcefully Annabella had raised her arm. The saint instinctively ran towards the maid. She arrived just in time and ended up right under the girl's hand. All the siblings tensed up upon seeing how hard she was hit in the face. The countess, for her part, was quite delighted by what had happened. Annabelle withdrew her hand and asked with disgust what she was doing. She asked if perhaps she had been moved by her situation, similar to Anne's. The saint calmly asked them to stop hitting her handmaiden. Annabelle said she deserved it, considering Anne's behavior. Violet disagreed and believed the maid was only answering questions. She was accused of covering up for the maid and of Annabelle's negligence. Eselund observed this altercation in silence. The saint saw his gaze and remembered he was not going to help her. She clenched her fist, realizing she had to protect herself alone. Violet asked directly how much longer he intended to ignore her. She added that she had done a lot to avoid conflict. The girl mentioned that she had even given her personal handmaiden. She instantly recalled all those brazen comments about Anne. Violet argued her words and demanded an answer. She understood she had to defend herself now and stepped forward. The saint approached the countess and mentioned words about her similarity to Anne. The girl darkened and declared that she also had to bow her head. The statement was so brazen that everyone froze. The saint said they must answer for mentioning her origin negatively. She added that the countess should be punished for her bad manners. The woman protested, but Violet reminded her of the saint's power. She mentioned that her power was equal to that of the king and the pope. The girl cited lines from the official history of aggression. She firmly concluded that the kingdom is based on those precepts. It was the first paragraph of the book everyone should know. Those lines were as important as air for a human. Violet had reread them many times, doubting their truthfulness. Right now she could defend herself, using those rules. Ed smiled when she called herself a symbol and a legend. The saint was truly the heart of aggression, creating integrity. The countess was startled, not expecting the girl to be able to defend herself. Violet added that her will should be more respected than that of a common young countess. She recalled that only the king or the pope could stop her. The girl turned to Annabella and told her to hit Anne again. She said that since she respected the guest's will, she must also respect hers. Annabella exploded and hit her in the face, calling her an arrogant commoner. Adrian shouted furiously, but Daniel stopped him. Annabella smiled, thinking this would destroy Violet. She believed it would be enough for the girl to back down. Her opinion changed instantly when the saint approached the countess. She severely ordered the woman to bow her head down. The countess apologized for her daughter and insinuated that the servants were watching. Violet saw that they were trying to manipulate and vilely scheme against her. She asked what they had been telling the servants about her. The countess trembled with rage and, seeing that her trick hadn't worked, looked hopefully at Ed, believing he would intervene. To her misfortune, Eselund told her to do what the saint ordered. He added that she had no right to influence their actions. It seems even Violet was surprised by his support. The countess clenched the edge of her dress, realizing she had lost. Everyone tensed up, commenting on what was happening in their hubbub. In the next instant, Violet raised her hand above her head. Annabella began to beg for her forgiveness for what she had done. She cried, pleading for clemency for her mother. Annabella directly asked her what she would do, as if provoking her. The girl understood that both options could make the saint look bad. She thought that playing the victim would save her, but she was answered with a smile. The saint sweetly touched the young woman and told her to get up. She admitted that she only wanted to play a little trick on everyone. The saint said she didn't want something like this to destroy their friendship. She smiled angelically and asked them to be lenient with Anne. Annabella was so humiliated that her body even trembled a little. Violet noticed, smiled, and said she had forgotten something important. She addressed the countess, frozen in a bow, and ordered her to relax. She barely said that, and suddenly they felt an imperative need to leave. The saint skillfully concealed the agitation, consuming her inside. Mother and daughter hurried away, but Ed called out to them. It seems Violet was not very pleased with his intervention. She was surprised when he said they forgot to say goodbye to the saint. According to etiquette rules, they had to bow before leaving. Ed added that he did not want to take responsibility for the infringements. The countess bit her lip in anger and bowed to Violet. After that bow, they ran back to the palace. Violet swallowed nervously, realizing that everything was over. Eselund kept looking at the girl thoughtfully. He ordered Anne to treat the saint's wound at the palace. Then he left, without saying a single word to Violet. On the way to the palace, Anne unintentionally recalled the events of the festival. Annabella begged to launch her lantern next to Daniel. Anne froze upon hearing the commotion about the appearance of the divine seal. She looked up and saw that same celestial symbol in the sky. The maid smiled happily, because this year the saint was with them. This instilled in people a sincere hope for better times. Following the saint's lantern came the lantern of the Marquisate representative. Annabella complained about not being the first at the festival. It seems Daniel understood everything and turned his head thoughtfully. He decided to leave the stand so he could reflect on everything. The next day, the saint was happily enjoying time with Anne. She made flowers bloom by chatting about how quickly the unwanted guests left. They left the estate literally the day after the incident. In the end, both were courteous and obedient towards the saint. Anne stood up and said that they too would soon return to the capital. In the blink of an eye, the cheerful Adrian ran towards them. The boy lunged at the saint and proposed going to the festival that night. Violet quickly decided to ask her older brother for permission. She doubted he would agree, but still decided to try. Adrian tried to say he would fix it, but his promises were not reassuring. After that, he fled as fast and offended as he could. Violet started looking for him after he got offended. She ran so fast that she accidentally stumbled upon Daniel. He was surprised when she asked for her older brother's office. Violet froze upon seeing his expression of displeasure. He reacted and asked the reason why she was looking for him. The girl said she wanted to ask permission to attend the festival. Daniel just touched her shoulder threateningly. He was about to refuse, but Adrian arrived running and said that the older brother had already authorized it. It seemed so incredible that everyone was astonished. Violet couldn't believe they had actually allowed it. Daniel left quickly, hiding his indignation. The saint was happy to be able to leave the castle walls. That very night, she put on a cloak so no one would recognize her. She couldn't imagine that the brothers would take her by the hands. No one mentioned that there would be 3 people instead of 2. Violet hated being led by the hand, but the sight of the streets changed everything. She was happy, but doubted they could be recognized and discovered. Eselund reassured her by saying that few remembered her face. Adrian never stopped joking about the strange trio. They moved forward, and Ed squeezed the girl's hand tighter. He watched her and noticed she still couldn't trust him. A vendor noticed how tightly he held her, as if afraid of losing her. She offered to show him jewelry that ladies love. The woman continued talking about how much they resembled each other. She asked why he was hiding his sister's beautiful face. He explained that she had a large scar and they might make fun of her. The woman felt sorry for her and asked him to extend his hand. In that instant, she fastened a bracelet on Violet's wrist. Violet was fascinated by such an exquisite jewel. Eselund calmly said to choose something else. The saint thought he wanted to buy something because of the grandmother's kindness. She decided to choose something cheaper so as not to be a burden. She couldn't utter a word when he pulled out a bag of gold. She grabbed his hand instantly, ordering him to hide the bag. She explained in a low voice that they might suspect something bad. It was obvious that a commoner couldn't have gold coins. Ed was surprised when she said the vendor wouldn't have change. He realized that knights usually took care of everything. The saint darkened upon realizing that he knew nothing about common life. She was amazed that this guy didn't even know what change meant. She calmly extended her hand and demanded the bag be returned. The grandmother smiled and said it was 10 copper coins. The saint frantically started searching his brother's bag. To her misfortune, there were only gold coins in that bag. In the end, she barely managed to gather enough to pay for the jewelry. Adrian saw her fighting spirit and said she was imitating knights. Eselund only severely repeated the word change, as if hearing it for the first time. He asked with complete seriousness if Adrian knew about it. Unlike him, Adrian knew it meant getting back the surplus if you gave too much. It seems even the mischievous boy was surprised that Ed didn't know about it. They became alert upon hearing the thunderous clatter of hooves. Violet turned around surprised and tried to identify the source of the noise. Apparently, Ed himself also felt that something was wrong and tensed up. He immediately pulled the girl's hand to move as far away as possible. Ed walked so fast that Adrian had to run to follow them. They continued moving until the saint started running out of breath. Finally, they reached the knights who were running after them. The knights shouted that an emergency had occurred. They didn't know the reason, but they already sensed the gravity of the situation. Meanwhile, Daniel and Anne ran right into this problem. Right in front of them appeared the Duke himself, whom they hated so much. He calmly got out of the carriage and walked straight towards the mansion. Caesar smiled slyly, as if deciding to show up at the Marquis's place. He still didn't know that the saint was at the festival market. Eselund frowned upon learning everything that had happened. Violet cautiously suggested that it was time for them to return. Adrian also didn't understand the reason and tried to find out the details. The children were surprised when their older brother flatly refused. He passed the information to the knight and said he trusted him. He barely managed to respond before Ed was already mounted on his horse and sped off. The man was left alone, at the mercy of 2 mischievous children. He accepted his fate, but was stunned to see the saint's hand. The knight felt blessed. It was his turn to hold the saint's hand. They were so engrossed in conversation that they even forgot about the fireworks. In the next instant, they found themselves surrounded by a crowd. Violet could only see the crushed face of the knight, who was moving further away. And further. They didn't even realize that, suddenly, the people had separated them. The saint tried to adjust her cloak. She didn't want to be discovered. She was alone in the middle of the road, not understanding where they had dragged her. Violet tried to move forward, but a stranger ruthlessly shoved her. He didn't measure his strength. The girl ended up rolling on the ground. A guy started shouting at her, accusing her of stealing his wallet. The young woman, stunned, vehemently denied it was her. The swindler threatened her with the police, demanding she take off her cloak. The saint knew everyone would see her silver hair and the bag of coins. The man noticed her distress and continued pressuring her in front of everyone. She froze when someone shouted, "Enough lies." In front of her was that priest, who looked like a very god. The thief defeated. He tried to claim that he had been robbed. He just smiled, remembering having seen him do the same to another girl. He added, mockingly, that they should really call the patrol. As soon as he mentioned the guard, the swindler fled in panic. The priest addressed the girl, saying they were meeting again. He pierced her with his amber eyes, as if they were molten lava. The girl thanked him for the help and agreed to go to a quiet place. The young man confessed that he had done nothing more than look for her. He thought they would meet if, in the end, he came here. The saint flinched when he said he almost killed that guy. He noticed her fright and apologized for the word he had used. The girl said she had to go back, but he intended to take her with him. She backed away and said her brother and a knight were waiting for her. The young man replied that he didn't want to hand her over to those he would forget in the temple. Violet realized for the first time how suspicious he was. Even his silver hair, like a saint's, put her on alert. Still, she decided to ask him a question to clear everything up. He smiled when she asked why both of them had the same hair color. As soon as she asked why no one noticed it, he asked her if she could see. He approached the girl and ordered her to name the color of his hair and eyes. The girl was paralyzed, but finally began to answer his questions. He fixed his gaze on her eyes when she mentioned the amber color. The young man hid in a corner, saying they would scold him now. Violet took advantage of his confusion to try to escape the situation. As soon as she announced her departure, he turned and looked at her fixedly. He shook off his clothes, affirming that he would still have another chance. The young man's eyes shone intensely, and he asked what she thought. He begged her to look at him and say that, truly, he wasn't that bad. She politely agreed, although she still didn't want to accompany him. He decided to escort her, answering questions about his appearance along the way. The young man said that, with sacred power, she too could hide her form. She was able to see his deception, thanks to her sacred power. However, he could hide his appearance even from her, if he wanted to. Their conversation was interrupted when a knight and Adrian ran towards them. The boy immediately started scolding her for disappearing so easily. He was surprised to see her in the priest's company. The knight composed himself and asked about her purpose. The priest calmly told them everything that had happened. Violet bowed politely and thanked him for his help. He looked her straight in the eyes and told her he was leaving. The saint decided not to tell anyone what had happened between them. She saw his back again and realized she never knew his name. The next day, the palace returned to its usual routine. While working, Anne mentally reviewed all the recent events. Many things have happened since Violet arrived at the mansion. The girl managed to learn to use her sacred power. She cried a lot for her friend and was even kidnapped. Anne couldn't express the pride in how Violet defended herself before the countess. She was sincerely happy to be able to watch the lady grow. After finishing the 7-day festival, spring cheered them up. However, Anne was still tormented by a single question. She couldn't understand why Violet was so depressed. Anne tried to coax the reason out of her, but the saint didn't want to talk. From her answers, the maid supposed it wasn't about returning to the capital. She saw how deeply Violet was absorbed in her thoughts. That same day, her carriage finally headed to the capital. Unfortunately, Anne couldn't find out anything about her sorrows. It distressed her to see how the girl's face grew darker and darker. The maid felt a jolt upon hearing the saint call her by name. To her astonishment, the saint firmly promised to protect her. Anne started turning over the possible reason for her words. The saint straightened up upon hearing a knock on the carriage. Eselund startled her by affirming that they had already arrived at the palace. After a long journey to the capital, they could finally exit the carriage. Anne looked ahead and for the first time understood the lady's anguish. Before them stood an offended countess, along with her daughter and the Marquis. She ostentatiously dried her tears, speaking of the humiliation suffered. The woman asked the Marquis to consider if there was a place for a saint in his family. She recounted how they threatened to slap her in front of the servants. The saint thought her days were numbered, and that this would infuriate the Marquis. After hearing Caroline's version, she turned to Ed seeking confirmation. The woman, dramatically, began to say that he was not to blame. She affirmed that the saint was trained in the art of manipulating men on the Flower Street. Caroline insisted that it would be much better to accompany her to the temple. Adrian came to the girl's defense, assuring that she had done nothing wrong. He mentioned that it was her own aunt who belittled Saint Violet. The saint doubted whether the Marquis would believe those words and leave her alone. She decided to try to defend herself and recalled how the maids humiliated her. The countess pointed at her with her finger, accusing her of being the worst liar. She smiled and asked if she perhaps wanted to slap her again. Violet lowered her gaze, while the other continued to mock her. She couldn't help wondering if she would have to go through something like this in the temple. It seemed to her that the Marquis would not tolerate the humiliation suffered by his younger sister. The man turned to her and told her that she herself knew what she had to do. He shocked everyone by saying this, not Violet but Caroline. The woman was paralyzed with shock when he ordered her to kneel. He confessed that he hadn't kicked her out, just to wait for the saint to arrive. Bjorn said sternly that she had now crossed all limits. He declared that her behavior had demonstrated her attitude towards the saint. The woman began to beg for forgiveness, shamefully saying how sorry she felt. Annabella decided to appeal to pity and burst into inconsolable tears. The countess asked how he could ask her to kneel before his daughter. The man swallowed, feeling disgust towards these individuals. He caressed the head of the crying Annabella with feigned sweetness. The Marquis unexpectedly proposed that she kneel instead of her mother. He said she was just as reckless as her progenitor. Bjorn asked if she thought he wouldn't find out about the beating the saint received. He reprimanded her for lying about how the saint had tormented her. The man asked if she would be capable of saying all that to the king. He made her realize how terribly wrong everyone was. Bjorn reiterated the great importance of the saint. The countess called Violet a commoner who suspiciously turned saint. Bjorn shouted, saying that he recognized this girl as his daughter. The countess couldn't believe he defended that creature so much. Despite the general tension, Violet felt joy at his words. The man calmed down and said that she lived on his property. In addition to this, the saint also received the surname Ermengarde. All these factors indicated that she had become the Marquis's daughter. Violet never imagined he would speak of her with such warmth. The Marquis settled the matter, completely shattering the countess's position. Violet only thought about the fact that he had called her his daughter. She didn't even realize that Ed was taking her hand. The young woman noticed that he was staring fixedly into her eyes again and blushed. Her astonishment was immense upon realizing that he had done it just like that. He just squeezed her hand, but she already felt calmer. The Marquis declared that the countess was no longer part of the Ermengarde clan. He added that his family would not receive her even as a guest. The man glared at her and said he would never forget how she humiliated his daughter. Caroline couldn't understand how he could consider that commoner his daughter. She knew he wasn't someone who spoke lightly and easily changed his mind. She decided to swallow her pride, as she didn't want to lose her status. Caroline appeared before the saint and bowed deeply. She begged the saint to grant forgiveness to her and her daughter. The Marquis observed Violet thoughtfully, as if she were making the decision. The girl ordered her to stand up and said she didn't want to hear any more about it. The woman touched the ground in silence and stood up slowly. She circled the saint, as if she were the main object of her hatred. Caroline left, swearing that Violet would pay for this humiliation. The Marquis waited for her to leave and ordered everyone to return. Everyone hurried back, feeling relief in their hearts. Only Violet remained, standing exactly where she was before. She thought all the problems were her fault and asked for forgiveness. The girl groaned and confessed to her father that she had been wrong. The man knew she wasn't to blame, but she usually blamed herself for everything. He gently stroked her head and asked what she was talking about. The Marquis smiled and said he had read her letters, where she always said she missed him. The saint thought it was the correct thing according to etiquette and didn't understand why he was smiling. She was embarrassed when she realized that Anne had completely tricked her. Before she could say a word, the Marquis lifted her in his arms. He said he didn't know what it was like to receive letters like that from his daughter. The Marquis smiled sweetly and said he missed her too. After that lovely scene, they returned to the palace together. Violet was dying of embarrassment because he was still carrying her in his arms. The saint turned bright red and begged him to let her down. The butler intervened, saying she was uncomfortable, and also asked him to put her down. He gently placed her on the floor and invited her to eat with the others. The Marquis noticed her confusion and supposed she still felt uncomfortable. The girl became sad and asked if it wasn't that they didn't want to see her. The Marquis froze upon hearing that she thought that was the problem. The man squatted down and explained that he just wanted her to be calm while eating. With those words, Violet's world, where no one loved her, completely changed. She feared being rejected because of her humble origin. She discovered that Finn was a liar and the Viscountess, a despot. She also experienced the kindness of Countess Razel, whom she had never seen. She lacked explanations, but never dared to ask. She decided to change and asked her father to have dinner together. The man smiled upon seeing the misunderstanding between them resolved. He gently squeezed her small hand and agreed to have dinner with everyone. That same night, she met the goddess again in her dream. The mysterious young woman tenderly stroked the saint's hair. Violet recounted how Adrian offered her food even when she was already full. The girl said she was no longer the same person who cried over mistreatment. Now she had become stronger, wiser, and much more self-assured. She explained that Adrian acted that way because he cared about her. Violet understood now, but she liked hearing those words. She was grateful that the goddess received her in her dreams. Her heart warmed seeing that a new family awaited her in real life. She froze, feeling something flying towards them from behind. Violet shuddered in fear, as if something terrible was about to happen. The goddess noticed how cautious the young woman had become. Violet tried to sniff and perceived a nauseating stench. That aroma was very familiar to her, as she smelled it in her dreams. After that, her dream broke, and she hurried to start a new day. She felt the pressure on her after everything yesterday. It seemed to her that the atmosphere was very different from before. The servants, previously indifferent, now adored Saint Violet. She smiled upon being greeted by the kind cook Jack. He noticed that she had grown a lot since they last said goodbye. Jack wanted to please the young woman and asked what she wanted for dinner. The girl smiled and said that whatever he prepared, she knew it would be delicious. Jack felt moved by those tender and sincere words about him. His moment of glory was immediately snatched away by a bunch of admiring maids. The girl felt uneasy about all those kind words from the women. She heard the question and replied that she simply wanted to come here alone. They rushed towards her, offering to accompany her everywhere. The maids immediately suggested a bunch of options for spending time. She hurried to escape so much attention and simply refused. Violet kept dwelling on the dream and decided to visit the chapel. It seems she didn't even notice how she got to this place herself. She still found such an amount of attention overwhelming. She decided to slightly open the door and enter the chapel interior. The place was empty, but a statue of a saint presided over it. She was the first revered saint of Agresia. Having turned into a legend, Violet wondered, unintentionally, why her eyes were closed. She examined it closely and noticed that it resembled the goddess from her dream. Violet pondered whether she could become like her. She turned around when Daniel said he knew she was there. She tried to decipher why he seemed so dejected. The young man stroked her head and told her that she had changed a lot. He added that she seemed like a stranger to him, but she flatly denied it. Daniel's smile faded, as if he were angry with the saint. He squeezed her hand tighter and asked if she really believed in God. Daniel noticed Violet's astonishment and stared fixedly at the statue. He recounted that he prayed to that God the day his mother was dying. He knew that his whole family prayed for the same thing, but God didn't show up. The young man felt like there was no one in the world as ignored as him. He looked at the girl sadly and said he didn't believe in God. The saint said nothing, but she perceived all his sadness and pain. She wanted to calm his soul and stroked her brother's cheek. He squeezed her fingers and told her he loved her above all else. Daniel felt her trembling and asked if she knew it. He eagerly kissed her small hand, saying she was his. The girl saw that sticky look and felt terror again. She remembered the dialogue with Malum when he claimed her as his own. She recalled that oppressive fear, grabbing her with claws. That fear enveloped her as if a predator captured its prey. He looked at her with red eyes and said she could never escape. Lost in all that, she pushed Daniel with all her might. It seemed to her that he didn't resemble the usual him at all. The girl trembled and apologized for her sudden rejection. She apologized again and fled as fast as she could manage. A few days later, the Marquis wanted to discuss the matter with her. They met alone around a table and drank delicious tea. She noticed the Marquis's thoughtful expression and didn't understand the reason. He had been sitting, upset, since he read the letter before dinner. Finally, the man announced that they would receive visitors today. He said sadly that 10 high priests would come to see them. The saint shuddered, understanding that the Marquis couldn't refuse. He used to refuse them, but they insisted that she study theology. The temple insisted that a high priest must instruct her. The young woman understood that she couldn't simply refuse. It saddened her that the Marquis was so grim because of her. The Marquis froze when she asked whom she should choose. It was as if she had given him the idea of how to regain control. He assumed they had already chosen the future male or female teacher. The saint blushed with embarrassment, believing she would choose. She reprimanded herself for letting something so absurd slip out without thinking. She said she misunderstood everything, but the Marquis congratulated her. He stared fixedly at her and affirmed that the choice was solely hers. That same day, they got down to work preparing. Her entire mind was tormented by the difficult choice. The temple divided aggression into 10 regions, each with a main temple. A high priest governed there and monitored the adherence to the rules. It was extremely rare for all of them to gather in one place. Before, not even the king had witnessed such an important event. The girl knew it was time to leave upon hearing her father's voice. She turned and felt a jolt upon hearing about the guest's arrival. Violet followed her father silently towards the door. The Marquis supported her, telling her she would do wonderfully. She observed her father's confident expression and felt calmer. He warned her that the priests would try to pressure them. He added that they must follow her will unconditionally. Beorn said that all the high priests would support the temple. Only Esteban seemed to have a pure soul and be friendly towards them. He told them to remember that he had a scar on his forehead and was young. The girl recalled those words again and prepared for the meeting. All members of the Ermengarde family waited for the priests. Violet felt the full weight of responsibility on her shoulders. She saw the sunlight and promised herself that she would overcome everything. A crowd of men bowed before her, and she felt that everything would turn out well. The chief high priest greeted the envoy of the gods. After the greeting, everyone was seated in the main hall. Violet carefully searched for the one with the scar on his forehead. After a brief search, she finally found the desired man. She felt that he emanated a much greater power than the rest. High Priest Dublin said that the Marquis could no longer ignore the Lord. He reprimanded him because the saint was still ignorant of theology. Violet explained that her training had been delayed due to her illiteracy. She admitted that her education was still insufficient to study the divine word. The priests attacked her, telling her to dedicate herself to studying. Violet clenched her hand and thought that they were no different from those on the flower street. She understood that, no matter how hard she tried, they only wanted a saintly image. The girl refused to give it to them and told them they were right. She added that she couldn't perform at her best due to lack of practice. Finally, she declared that she had to choose a mentor for herself. Everyone was shocked by her authoritarian and risky decision. Dublin muttered that she lacked the erudition for an accurate choice. The girl froze at his question about criteria she hadn't considered. From the beginning, she simply knew which priest to choose. Violet felt that immense power again and had a revelation. She said that, indeed, she could not trust her mental abilities. She added that these should not be a criterion, even if she possessed them. The saint expressed her conviction that everyone is worthy of her instruction. She said she would determine the mentor by the strength that God invested in each one. Dublin frowned, realizing he had cornered them. One of the priests wanted to clarify something and raised his hand. That same priest declared that they should hide their faces. The saint tensed up, feeling her plan crumbling. He added that it wasn't necessary for her to know who they were or what they looked like. The others supported him, suggesting turning their backs and putting on a scarf. The girl looked at her father in bewilderment, seeking support. He held her firmly, as if ordering her to accept. Within a minute, all the priests bowed before her. The saint swallowed tensely, feeling the weight. Beorn pressured her and demanded that she make her choice. Instantly, she began to analyze the power of each one. She had to find the priest with the purest energy. Finally, she opened her eyes with joy. She had found him. She moved forward without hesitation, ready to announce her decision. All her siblings watched the outcome with tension. She stopped in front of the man, and everyone took off their robes. Violet could not believe what she was seeing. She had chosen wrongly. She distinguished High Priest Esteban in the distance, watching her. She didn't understand what was happening. He was the most powerful source of energy. Violet started racking her brains. Who had she chosen then? The high priest she chose bowed and took her hand. He took off his robe, revealing his red hair before everyone. Everyone was stunned upon hearing the voice of Duke Caesar. It seems that even the priests were gaping at this. At that instant, Violet understood that her success was impossible. Caesar smiled, recalling his promise to return to her.